misuse if we don't find a way to implement them that isn't censorial in nature? How do we do this? I don't know yet. We can regroup at the conclusion. So let's head to the historical background portion of this video.
Jack Valenti, Secretary of New York at the film industry, plans to set up a voluntary rating system.
Starting in 1922, the Motion Picture Association has been in charge of the rating system around film, which ramped up significantly during the era known as the Hays Code. If you subscribe to Be Kind Rewind, as you should, then you are likely familiar with the Hays Code. Her latest video goes into a good amount of detail about pre-code and the Hays Code and how it impacted the movies that we now have access to. As a quick refresher, the Catholic Church and other religious organizations were against a lot of secular art and saw it as being part of the demise of American society. In the 1930s, the Catholic Church declared that Hollywood, with its muck merchants, had been working to destroy the moral fiber of the American people.
Sorry, kids, we don't go to church anymore. We go to sinners. What are we doing? What's going on?
Usually, these kind of whinging pamphlets would not have been an issue, but it was the time of the Great Depression. There was no room to risk alienating any of the movie-watching audiences. And so the movie czar, Will Hays, bent the knee to the church, and we got the Hays Code. What also added this pressure to introduce morality to Hollywood were several back-to-back incidents where celebrities at the time were caught up in accusations of murder, rape, and other crimes. Most notable is the case surrounding silent-era film star Roscoe Arbuckle, known as Fatty Arbuckle, who you might know from the subplot on Hacks.
I put the jokes and comics on, so you know they're supposed to be funny.
Now that makes sense.
He was accused of the rape and manslaughter of a fellow actor, Virginia Rapp, 3 times before he was finally acquitted. The general consensus now is that he was not responsible for her death, nor did he rape her. His trials, as well as the still unsolved murder of actor William Desmond Taylor, gave religious groups the ability to point to film stars needing to represent a more moral image for American society.
What I would say to Brittany, if I saw her on the street, I'd tell her, think about those 12-year-olds that listen to your music, and think about the 12-year-olds who saw you on the VMAs, and think what they're thinking. They probably are thinking that it's okay to dress like that, which it's not.
I'm not their parent, man.
So the code had prohibitions on, and let me just pull it up properly, prohibitions on nudity, suggestive dances, discussions of sexual perversity, nudity, superfluous use of liquor, ridicule of religion, miscegenation, lustful kissing, scenes of just in case it wasn't clear, discussions of sexual perversity means gay people. When the Hays Code finally ended in 1968, the MPAA put out an official rating system that has changed since in small ways. In the beginning, it was rated G, which was for general audiences, rated M, which was for mature audiences, parental discretion advised, R, restricted, persons under 16 not admitted unless accompanied by a parent or adult guardian.
That sounds very vague, the way she stated it.
This was expanded to include PG from 1972 to 1984, and then eventually PG-13 was added due to movies like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom and Gremlins for having gore and violence that was seen as too adult for children, but also too silly for adults. They didn't realize that eventually the line between children and adult entertainment would be whittled away by a failing economy and the rising cost of childcare that makes a lot of us who would be having children choose not to and instead raise our own inner child. Anyway, getting rid of the Hays Code, however, did not erase the years of homophobic and sexist normalcy in the film industry. So even what would get certain ratings seems to be somewhat arbitrary. As explored in the documentary, This Film Is Not Yet Rated, which came out in 2006.
Well, in a
I don't know if I believe that narrative. That seems really fake.
So I think that even in sex scenes, I think that it's from a male perspective. So I don't think that the focus is female pleasure. I think that female pleasure is unnatural. I think female pleasure is scary.
Something that were brought to light at the time were that the board treated homosexual material much harsher than heterosexual material, and it seemed as though acts of non-traditional sex or female pleasure were stigmatized in a way that male pleasure was not.
I got a call from the ratings board, and they said, you got an NC-17. And I was really angry and really devastated, and I didn't understand why, because there's no nudity in the sex scene, and they're fully clothed. It was ridiculous.
Movies are not the only rating system that have a history of bias. The same complaints have been made about music ratings and comic books and video games.
Compiled a list of songs they found particularly offensive, branded the Filthy 15.
What they all have in common is being somewhat reactionary in its nature. They often target black and brown projects. They ignore violence towards women, but penalize female pleasure and queerness. It creates a lowbrow, highbrow dichotomy of art that treats certain things as vulgar and other things as sublime, depending on, you know, who made it. Now, I'm not a libertarian, so I don't believe in kind of a free-for-all, no rating system. There should be some indicator of what is in a work and for what age range it is appropriate for, but that system is and will likely always be imperfect. And it's held up by people with much bigger pockets and less empathy, especially since that system is often about parents and the conversations they don't want to have with their children, rather than what is actually healthy for a young developing mind.
Won't somebody please?
Coco Melon is more dangerous than any drag queen for your child's development. It is baby crack, derogatorily. One of the things that really started to click to me about the limits of trigger warnings was how, following the beginning of the COVID pandemic, there was a massive influx of people being more aware of what was being taught at schools, but what that came with was the beginning of this new wave of censorship that has been largely impacting books written by marginalized identities. The weaponization of protected children is a tried and true aspect of the religious right. They use children as a shield for their bigotry.
Moms for Liberty worked with Governor Ron DeSantis to pass what critics call the Don't Say Gay bill that bans any discussion of sexual orientation or gender identity until the 8th grade. Is that the kind of thing that you support?
Don't say gay.
This is not my opinion. Like, we are a Christian family. It's God's opinion.
Rather than just saying they are opposed to gay people, they just don't want their children forced to deal with things because they haven't been properly programmed yet. I mean, are old enough to understand. Disney went from being a concerned that young girls were getting indoctrinated with heteronormativity to a place where the right wing is now concerned about young girls getting indoctrinated with being gay.
Well. How the turntables.
If we talk about rating systems and what they stem from, a lot of them really stem from a very core conservative mindset. And it is dangerous when that conservative mindset then goes downward into the way that we talk about art and how we protect each other. The Citrus scale was my first fan fiction tag system. And if you are at least 28 to 30 years old, you are very aware of the fruit system. There was orange, light stuff, kissing, usually just a light below the waist underclothes activity. A lime had groping, some implied sex, not a lot of detail. Fade to black. Lemon was sex, baby. It was very mwah. But if you were on fanfiction.net and you wanted to get even spicier, there was adult fanfiction.net. the North remembers. And I just got a text being told that there is a grapefruit in the citrus scale, but I don't know about that, so I'm not gonna address it.
I won't hear it, and I won't respond to it.
I then remember trigger warnings on Tumblr as sort of a broader tag system
shit
that was
name.
there, but also on fanfiction tags or on AO3. Tags are a way to really illustrate to people what they are about to read, and from anything from the light, fluffy kissing to anal fisting, you put it on the tag so that the reader knows this is what you're about to get.
Oh,
when you see
read
something that's tagged,
anal
then does, don't read
fisting?
a lot
What
of
the
development
fuck
bit.
is
It's telling you
that?
exactly what you are worried could happen will happen. It is on the tin.
Oh
I don't know what I
Double
expected.
And while
install.
fandom and the current book space is where a lot of trigger warning conversations happen, is much broader than that. Trigger warnings came about from knowledge surrounding post-traumatic stress disorder, from the idea that certain smells, sounds, and actions could trigger memories. Veterans were especially a big part of this, especially post the Vietnam War, where so many soldiers came back with mental and physical health issues, and also being the first generation to have fought a very unpopular war. But people can have PTSD from a number of things: domestic violence, accidents, rape, and while a lot of the study is rooted in veterans and rape, this idea that PTSD can only exist in extreme circumstances is an oversimplification. And the idea of a trigger warning list makes sense, and that you can filter out depending on the website to avoid as much of it as possible. The internet can be modded in a way to overall make it a safe space. It is your free time. You should be able to feel comfortable. When the concept of trigger warnings went from internet
No,
to
you
online
shouldn't.
interaction
What
to
the
the outside
fuck?
world, we saw the term
Why
become part
should
of a
you
new
feel
culture war.
comfortable on the
Higher education
internet?
was dealing with a generation of college students who were asking for trigger warnings in their classrooms, especially around subjects like rape. One often noted example was from the University of Santa Barbara. Student Bailey Loverin, a survivor of sexual assault, asked for campus-wide trigger warnings after a film screening featured a rape scene.
Calling for trigger warnings on course syllabi to alert students who have had a traumatic experience like sexual abuse.
It's about students that could be suffering from PTSD and not wanting to be triggered in the middle of an 800-person classroom and feeling afraid or feeling completely out of control.
She said she was not triggered by the scene, but was thinking about her peers and their comfort. Much of the campus trigger warning conversation have been presented as students versus faculty,
What
largely
the
talking about female
fuck?
students.
Growing up in a society that has all these warnings already, and it's not necessarily an irrational proposal.
The Atlantic then published the very, very trendy piece, The Calling of the American Mind. And it was a cynical and I would say hyper-simplistic take on the issue from two white men who were out of touch when they wrote it and remained so.
And that's part of the problem. When you turn it into something that's fundamentally about sort of someone's subjective response, it very quickly creates what Connor Fugedorf talks about, that essentially, why should your trauma be privileged over mine?
Now, I was done with my education journey at the time when this picked up in the public eye, and I do remember the disdain that people had for these younger students. And at the cranky age of 34, I get it. Sometimes kids today comes out of my mouth. When 10 years ago you were a legal adult still, you experienced life differently. What the writers of that Atlantic piece declare is that safe spaces and trigger warnings cause students and leave them unprepared for real life, which college is meant to prepare them for, by giving them a lot of debt they can't get out of right at the start of their adult lives and make them permanently tethered to the government, their jobs, for access to healthcare. There are some people who want trigger warnings and content warnings so they can make informed choices, and then there are people who want to be cops. They want to police everyone around them and force people to bend their taste for their own sake. They want to be in community, but only if you think and agree with them. And I don't mean about politics. I think we should curate that. But in terms of the kind of art you consume inherently, becomes shorthand for your values. If you like dark gothic stories, all of a sudden you are pro-incest, and that is ridiculous. Tied with that is also the weaponization of identity and flattening a lot of nuance to, again, be a cop and declare that someone is the enemy because they disagree or push back or have a different perspective of how triggers affect them. It doesn't help that the face of this conversation overwhelmingly becomes cis white women or queer white women. This allows the narrative of people needing trigger warnings becoming the spoiled and overly invested in
Jesus,
trauma
is it just
demographic,
keep
and they get to have a comfortable time
categorizing
that
this
people can
woman?
swallow, which is
Jesus,
frustrating. And yes, there
I
are
can't
definitely
stand
people who are married to their
Americans.
trauma in unhealthy ways, which are definitely
that
being
simple
accelerated
for
through the
you?
pandemic. Yes, people will weaponize their identities and use therapy speak in order to position themselves as victims. I also watch couples therapy. That has nothing to do with the underlying question of if trigger warnings serve a purpose for those who need it. After all, women are not the only victims of rape. But again, it's also important to ensure that we are not opening the space to censorship.
they even
Part
the
of what we have
most?
seen with book bans is weaponizing those same liberal talking points to censor books like Beloved by Toni Morrison and saying it just blanketly depicts bestiality and gave one teenager nightmares without understanding the context of the work.
We can give our kids iPads, we can give our kids phones, but you're taking Beloved by Toni Morrison out of our libraries? Guess whose job it is to make sure it's appropriate for your children? The librarians!
We talk about trauma porn very liberally, ignoring that art is a way in which some creatives work out their own trauma. It may be imperfect, and in some cases the book can be bad or have poor execution, but would you then argue that it shouldn't exist or it should be heavily censored or limited? And if so, how are you going to regulate it? Who decides that art is meant to be a safe space?
Well, I think, again, the different perspectives. I think it's important we know the different perspectives, but at the same time, like I said, I'm white. And, just because I'm white doesn't mean that we're slaveholders.
I think in general, the trigger warning discussion is the beginning of a larger way of how we can talk to each other when we are in community. So much of this becomes a them versus us. And then once that segregation has happened, we're all us. And now, even amongst us, we now have a diversity of opinions and feelings and triggers. And now, how do we get to the next step in that reality? One of my favorite shows of all time is HBO's The Sopranos. It's one of the greatest shows ever made, changed the landscape of television, responsible for the aesthetic amongst most prestige television, etc. You know. Also has one of the handful of moments on TV that genuinely triggered me. Members Only is the first episode of season 6 and centers around the minor character of Eugene. Eugene is one of the made men of the family and is revealed to be an FBI informant. He attempts to leave the life and move to Florida after inheriting $2 million, but neither Tony, the boss, or the FBI will allow him to leave the mafia life. Seeing no way out and attempting to give his family their best chance for a future, he hangs himself in his basement. The scene goes on for a long time. It shows everything in agonizing detail, and as someone who has lost family to suicide by hanging and has her own mental health issues, it put me in a really bad place, and I couldn't find my remote. It was like almost like a dark I Love Lucy moment. I couldn't find my remote to mute it. I just panicked, and I closed my door, and I turned off the TV. I just ran to call my then girlfriend, and she became my safe space. She talked me through it, and once I was breathing again, turned back on my TV and skipped to the next episode, kept watching with my remote close by so that I could have some control again over what I was watching. Hangings, I have discovered over the last almost decade of having this particular trigger, are very common in media, even children's media. I cannot watch the last climactic scene of Tarzan. Even the latest Wuthering Heights film opens on a long execution scene where the hanging is part of the sexual voyeurism. Criminals lined up at the gallows is a frequent visual in many a period drama. Video games will just have dead rotting corpses rotting from nooses all around them. And while art and media are forms of escapism for me, that escapism doesn't necessarily make it a safe space. Conflict is a part of storytelling, and I don't get to tell the storyteller in advance what my triggers are. I have to, in a sense, give myself up to the risk of being triggered or being uncomfortable with something. And then if I am triggered, finding my safe space and having safe space films. You know, I watch Kiki's Delivery Service, A Little Princess, Beauty and the Beast, Possession, if I want to have a relaxing experience where I know what is going to happen and can prepare myself mentally. Even some of my favorite horror movies are safe spaces because I know the ending. Scream, despite all the issues I have with the latest installment, is absolutely a comfort movie franchise for me because in the end, despite all the blood and gore and trauma, it's going to be okay. In fact, one of the reasons why the horror genre is such a comforting space for people is because getting through a traumatic experience is built into the storytelling. There's also this issue with people wanting to dabble in genres or media considered gothic or dark, but their feelings on those subject matters are fairly juvenile. Author S.T. Gibson just addressed this in a latest Substack post, The Gothic is Not Aesthetic, where they wrote, genres get defanged in this machine, turned into nothing more than a mood board, when in fact they are deeply rooted in history and materiality, themes and intellectual movements, and most importantly,
you see that?
The Gothic, previously a niche subgenre of horror for weirdos, lover girls and lover boys, and most of all freaks, has gotten a glossy trend cycle makeover.
Fuck away
And I hate
from
to say
me.
it's being stripped of meaning in the process. I talked about Gothic incest in my video about the White Lotus on Patreon, and one of the things I noticed that even within the transgressive, there is a societal construction that the author is trying to address. How repression creates these fissures in the soul that get warped. There are certain themes that a Gothic story has, and those themes are transgressive because those transgressions are necessary to explore the themes of that genre. The incest is not just there to explore incest, it is there to
I've
show
never
how insular and
seen
suffocating that space
incestuous
is, how there
this
is no
bad.
room to grow. And so instead of meeting new people and growing and modernizing and evolving, there is a degradation and a continued dilapidation that happens spiritually, aesthetically, and sexually. And mind you, I'm not saying that every work that covers this is like some great work. I don't love every classic piece of literature, but the point is that there are themes that these works deal with. And I do wonder if at times people will use the trigger warning to sort of not engage with certain things. I do find myself to a certain point agreeing with the sentiment that the way trigger warnings are so casually pushed out leaves room for self-censorship issues that we are seeing as a massive problem in how we communicate. Saying words like grape instead of rape and not being able to call something a genocide or name a country. While the other side are making millions of dollars posting the same anti-feminist boring video game takes for the past 10 years, we also have seriously allowed our ability to critically think for ourselves and form our own opinions atrophy and see any disagreement as an attack, to see any discomfort as inherently problematic. I also see trigger warnings as limiting because sometimes they don't actually account for what could be triggering, if that makes any sense. Like, I like content warnings, and I'm still always going to do them when I know that it's going to be there because I think, you know, we live in community. But I will say I do find myself often feeling as though, you know, what is the proper trigger warning for racism, especially casual racism? So I'm currently watching The Other Bennett Sister on BritBox, which I am enjoying despite being a
It's so bad not getting that bored.
That'll be another topic. Maybe I'll talk about it on Patreon once the show is actually done. But one of the things that instantly stood out for me in the first 4 episodes on American BritBox is how many emotional support people of color have been there to uplift Mary. And I'm just like, you know, it's not that I think it's a trigger warning or a content warning, but it's funny how with all the conversations about that, there is still this inability to like still understand how to deal with racism in art, casual racism that the audience themselves don't pick up on. Like, and I think that's kind of like a bigger way of talking about a trigger warning. It's like, while that wasn't triggering for me, it instantly was this feeling of like, oh, here we go again. What is the trigger warning for watching Invincible and seeing the disposable black girlfriend archetype yet again? You know, what's going to be the trigger warning for, you know, the fact that you go and see all beige people in your production? You know, like there are so many things that are triggering, not because they attack you and still how they inflame you. How they show this persisting ignorance that can just be so.
I can speak to this person.
Flames. On the side of my face.
That being said, I don't want all art to be soft and cozy. That's not how I am as a writer. It's not what I'm drawn to. And I think there is room for it. But in asking for art to be trauma-free, we are inherently asking for conflict-free art. Something that even when BIPOC people do, it gets labeled as unrealistic. Society is both very cynical and very silly at the same time. Frustration with individuals allows a blurring understanding about collective good as well. Trigger warnings in general, despite its limitations, in my opinion, do come from a good place, a place of wanting the collective to be okay, and that certain places should offer you a idea of safety. School should be a safe place, but it isn't because of gun violence, rape culture, racism, sexism, and the silencing of academics who support social justice. So when that is already the reality for students, yeah, they want to grab some control, and the trigger warning is the joystick. They are trying to slay this fire metaphorically, trying to have some power over society where they have to hear that the Supreme Court just rolled back civil rights while going into a classroom where every book in the English lit course written by a non-white person is about racism. You know, it's exhausting, and I think academia has to make room for that. And I think the best teachers find a way to do that. As Kristen and Mendoza says, trigger warnings acknowledge the existence of survivors in our midst, address the array of emotional and psychological preparedness students inhabit before immersing themselves in the content of the class, and help to cultivate an environment of care and solidarity. That is a positive thing, because while school is supposed to prepare you for real life, it's also a community where you live. And if you are going to be there and be challenged, it should be a conversation. And just like you study for something, you should be able to prepare yourself for what you face next. You should be able to talk to students who are anxious about addressing rape in a story, about what can be learned from that. As Mendoza explains, in 2015, she planned to teach The Rape of Lucrece, a poem by Shakespeare, which coincided with a rape case that actually happened on campus. Mendoza leaned into that real event as a learning tool and gave everyone a trigger warning and encouraged them to still attend class after doing what they needed to do to prepare. And what happened as a result was an even deeper conversation that everyone was prepared for, but that everyone felt comfortable participating in. And I think that we should give people the ability to disappoint us. Like don't just immediately throw them under the bus. By prompting students to remember, reflect on, and restate the ideas that were developed in class analysis of key terms like chastity and honor, I provided students with a concrete approach to our conversation on the Vanderbilt trial. Students knew that they could apply the same critical thinking skills we had been practicing to their analysis of the trial defense's argument that a campus culture glorifying binge drinking and promiscuity should be blamed. I also opened our conversation to more personal approaches by asking students if they followed the case and the issues it raised for themselves and their peers. Every student attended and participated in that day's discussion, which set the tone for the remainder of the course. All of this shows that what is needed is empathy and understanding. Even if you find something annoying because teaching requires meeting people where they are, especially when you're teaching people how to critically think, you still need to use your emotions for that. And learning to work with trigger warnings opens you up to reaching a lot more people than you think.
Even one of the staunchest advocates of labeling thinks this goes too far. But for her, it's a question of who gets to decide.
I don't think labeling is a bad thing, but for curriculum and things, I don't know that the kids get to call the shots.
I do fundamentally have mixed feelings about trigger warnings in front of a book, mostly because for me they don't help, and I think that especially in today's landscape of marketing, heavy trope-wise, I don't think that some of the nuances of what causes a trigger are properly addressed in trigger warnings. And ultimately, I feel as though they ask the author to come up with a checklist of harms rather than actually focus on crafting a text that incorporates all of those themes well, and then asking your readership to be prepared for that. I think that part of consuming art is intellectual curiosity, and that means being vulnerable, and some people are willingly avoiding that. And also, I think what is happening as well with trigger warnings is that it ends up heavily
everyone's avoiding that. That's the problem with the internet.
I have yet to see someone say seriously that it should have a trigger warning onto it because it's a horror novel by Stephen King. No one tells
the fact that trigger warnings are only,
they'll tell you that, but they're not going to put that on the tin for you.
We're talking about things that
a lack of trust. And I think that we should be aware
such a limited scope of things. It's such a greater scope of things that could be encompassed in trigger warnings. It's just not being talked about or addressed.
You can't do due diligence. You can't actually interrogate what the book is about. You know, when my mother would buy a rated M video game for my brother, she would go to GameStop and she would ask, okay, why is this rated M? What is it going to do to my child's development? Like, what actually is it? Being curious. I think that that's one of the things I really admire about my mother as a parent is that she always asked the next question. And she would ask the librarian or the teacher or the bookseller. And if she thought it was too much, she said no. But if she thought, okay, it's this, you can play it. Again, while I do think that content warnings and trigger warnings have a purpose, especially in shared community spaces, I do think we should be careful about censorship. We should always be careful about censorship because they are taking the exact same things that we say and turning them into conservative slut. And we see it happen with things like kink at pride discourse and all these other kind of things. Like, it drips in there because of this inability to discuss, to sit in discomfort, and also, that kind of sounds a little boomery, but taking personal responsibility for self-care. Like, self-care also means knowing how to deal with it. It's different for everybody. And I'm definitely coming from a perspective of someone, like, I'm on medication to regulate my emotions because I need it. And it took me a long time to deal with that. Like, I have learned, and my friends also know, that if there's a movie with a hanging in it, to let me know. I remember when The Star is Born film with Lady Gaga came out, and that ending sequence, very triggering, very, very triggering, and my friend didn't know that, and I told her, now you know, and now whenever something's about to happen in a movie that she doesn't want to see, she's like, this happens at this point, like, maybe let me know. Because I'm still gonna watch it, I still have interest in it, but I want to be prepared, and if I do see it, you know, usually I wear a hat to movies so I can kind of look down. Like, even with opening Wuthering Heights, during that sequence, I kind of just, like, had my cap on and I kind of looked down, because it made me uncomfortable. It was triggering, but I'm at a space with my triggers where I can deal with it because I've done that work. And that's work that I have been privileged enough to be able to do. And overall, this is not a final statement, it is a conversation, and I would love to hear what you guys think, especially considering, again, the ways in which a lot of the rating systems and these content warnings and trigger warnings are framed, who is making them, what work they are for, and how the line is continuously blurred between what is appropriate and who gets to decide that.
Hi, I'm Rosie, this is Mouse, and today we're going to discuss the short story collection Daughters of Decadence. Before we get into this, I want to warn you that this video deals with topics of a sensitive nature, including eating disorders, domestic abuse, medical abuse, and mental health. Daughters of Decadence, edited by writer and critic Elaine Showalter and published in 1993, is a collection of short stories by English and American women living and writing during the fin de siècle, a phrase which literally translates to end of the century, but here refers to the specific cultural movement happening at the turn of the 20th century. The most famous of the stories in the collection is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, which I'll go on to analyse in detail in this video. But first, a little context about the collection, its history, and its significance for us today as contemporary readers. Many of the writers featured in Daughters of Decadence are writing about or responding to the idea of the new woman, a cultural phenomenon that redefined the concept of womanhood. Now, a little disclaimer, the term new woman, exactly what it means or meant at the time, has been debated and contested, and is still a subject of debate in the field today. Essentially, there's a lot going on with the term, and
wow, am I on to spend all day?
The term new woman was coined by Sarah Grand, who was a writer featured in Daughters of Decadence in 1894. For some, the new woman was bold, bicycle riding, trouser wearing. She questioned the assumption that a woman's ultimate purpose was to be a wife and mother, and promoted the benefits of an independent lifestyle. For others, the new woman symbolised moral downfall. She was selfish, rude, a sexually promiscuous erotomaniac, and she signalled the end of domestic peace and traditional Victorian family values. She was frequently the subject of satire, repeatedly lampooned in the popular Victorian magazine Punch. There was a division, then, between the new woman and her opponents. But did new women writers all agree when it came to the subject of women's rights? No. Just like the romantics before them, new women weren't all sat around a table together writing for the same cause. They disagreed on all kinds of subjects, from the value of motherhood to civil rights to sexual freedom. According to Sally Ledger and Roger Luckhurst in their book, The Fin de siècle, A Reader in Cultural History, what supporters of the new woman did agree on, however, was the necessity of a broader education for women, as well as access to a wider cultural world than that deemed suitable for the bulk of middle-class Victorian women. So while there are some shared values, it's important to remember that exactly what was being fought for or championed by the new woman movement isn't clear-cut. Additionally, it's important not to conflate the term new woman with feminism. A lot of the women featured in Daughters of Decadence hold views that aren't necessarily what we might consider feminist today. According to Professor Margaret Stetz, George Egerton, whose story A Crossline features in the collection, hated being associated with other new women writers. She also advocated not for civil rights, but sexual rights for women. So we might read their work through a feminist lens or call their writing proto-feminist, but we can't say all new woman writers are feminists, etc. Not least because the meaning of the term feminist has shifted over time, and of course, the specific meaning of feminism is widely contested today, with different factions and opposing ideologies at play. It's all very messy. So just know that there's a lot to the term new woman, more than I can reasonably fit into this video. And if you're interested in learning more, this book has some useful information, though it's a bit pricey as an academic text. So with all that in mind, what were some of those traditional Victorian values the symbol of the new woman sought to question or challenge? In his poem, The Angel in the House, published in parts between 1854 and 1862, Coventry Patmore set out what he saw as the ideal woman. Man must be pleased, but him to please is woman's pleasure. Down the gulf of his condoled necessities, she casts her best, she flings herself.
Yeah,
and if he, once by shame
him.
oppressed, a comfortable word confers, she leans and weeps against his breast, and seems to think the sin was hers. Or any eye to see her charms, at any time she still his wife, dearly devoted to his arms. She loves with love that cannot tire, and when, ah woe, she loves alone, through passionate duty love springs higher, as grass grows taller round a stone. We can get a sense of the duty expected of the ideal woman in Patmore's eyes. Not only will she put his pleasure and happiness first, but she will absorb his woes, be held accountable for his sins. She's devoted in every sense of the word, and her love cannot tire. Later, in 1871, Charles Darwin's The Descent of Man helped to confirm these expectations of women's roles. In her 1985 study, The Female Malady, Women, Madness and English Culture, 1830 to 1980, Showalter argues that, according to Darwin, through natural selection, man had become superior to woman in courage, energy, intellect, and inventive genius, and thus would inevitably excel in art, science, and philosophy. Even those faculties in which women had the edge, intuition, perception, and imitation, were actually signs of inferiority, and I'm quoting Darwin here, characteristics of the lower races, and therefore of a past and lower state of civilization. Ugh. These ideas were then taken up and developed by different doctors and incorporated into a highly prescriptive late Victorian psychology of women. Women, of course, were seen as natural caretakers, their minds and bodies predisposed to rearing children, and there was a premium placed on a woman's fertility. Psychiatrist Henry Maudsley argued that the intellectual training of adolescent girls could produce permanent injury to their reproductive systems, and suggested that the stimulus of competition would ruin girls while bringing out the best in boys. It's interesting to note the language Maudsley uses and its similarity to the language used by some physicians when describing the causes and symptoms of consumption or pulmonary tuberculosis in the Romantic period, a topic you can learn more on in my video, link in the description. He talks about a woman's vital energy and how a woman will often use all of her vital energy up menstruating, leaving her little energy for anything other than reproduction. Consumptives were also believed to have a store of vital energy that the disease could easily use up if the patient didn't eliminate all external stimuli. Maudsley believed that if a woman or girl did indeed expend her vital energy, it could lead to the degeneration of the reproductive capacity, beginning with the atrophy of the breasts and ending with a total loss of pelvic power or sexless sterility. So in general, behaviour that was seen to jeopardise a woman's fertility or ability to mother a child was considered a big problem and would often be ruled as an illness, as a nervous disorder, but more on that later. The domestic feminine ideal that so many doctors advocated to prevent a woman from befalling the worst possible fate, that of becoming infertile of course, was challenged by the new woman. Rather than devotion to marriage and motherhood, new women symbolised choice, freedom, education, and an end to prescriptive gender roles. To some of their critics, this meant that they were, in the literal sense, daughters of decadence, inheritors to Oscar Wilde and the decadent literary movement that, in the eyes of some, practiced immorality and indulgence while championing the concept of art for art's sake, rather than art as didactic or morally instructive. Though it's worth pointing out that in many ways, the new woman was not allied with male writers of the decadent movement, in spite of their seemingly shared interest in blurring gender boundaries and inciting sexual revolution. In some cases, these male decadent writers and aesthetes even displayed what Showalter calls an anti-feminist stance in their work. The stories collected in Daughters of Decadence refigure all kinds of assumptions about women's roles. That a woman had no real sexual purpose other than to bear children and satisfy her husband's needs, that she's best suited to the home, that she can never be equal to or superior than a man. All these ideas come under fire. We might also say that these stories challenge the male gaze, to use a contemporary term, particularly when it comes to a woman's physicality. The character Lady Tal, for example, in Vernon Lee's story of the same name, is repeatedly alluded to in terms of her physical robustness. The male protagonist, Gervase Marion, describes her as this big woman in her stiff clothes with her inexpressive face, or says things like, Lady Tal raised one of those delicately penciled, immensely arched eyebrows of hers. The great size of her eyebrows comes up a lot. And there's this sense of her physical enormity all the way through the story, and this transfers over to Gervase Marion's perception of her emotional robustness. He describes her as so oppressively grown up, powerful, able to cope with everything. My favourite description of Lady Tal gives me serious Lady Dimitrescu vibes. He saw Lady Tal's stately figure, her white dress, promenades in the moonlight, a rabble of young men and women at her heels. In Sarah Grand's The Undefinable of Fantasia, the unnamed male narrator's internal reverie, in which he compares his female model to iconic beauties throughout history, is brilliantly interrupted by the model herself. Why, from the crown of her head to the sole of her foot, what expression! There was a volume of verse in her glance. Oh, Sappho, a bounteous vitality in her whole person. Oh, Ceres, an atmosphere of life, of love surrounded her. Oh, Venus, a modest reserve of womanhood. Diana, get on, do! She broke in upon my fervid analysis. Another trope that crops up in a number of the stories is the inclusion of a male protagonist, like those I've just described, who is somehow overcome and eventually undone by a woman who challenges him on an emotional or intellectual level. Again, we can turn to Grand's The Undefinable of Fantasia for an example of this. The male narrator's relationship with his female model leaves him struggling to control his emotions, and he describes how his words burst from me involuntarily. And by the end of the story, he resigns himself to obsessively searching the streets for his model, who abandons him. Constance Fenimore Wilson's Miss Grief is a story about a talented yet unknown female writer, Arona Creef, who persists in getting the unnamed male narrator to read her work, and through doing so forces him to reflect on his entitlement and intellectual capacity. On her deathbed, Creef says to the narrator, who is also a writer, "Did you wonder why I came to you? It was the contrast. You were young, strong, rich, praised, loved, successful, all that I was not. I wanted to look at you and imagine how it would feel. You had success, but I had the greater power. Tell me, did I not have it?" To which he replies, "Yes, Arona." These men are forced to reflect on their privilege, class-based and gender-based assumptions, and generally conclude their tales emotionally unravelled in one way or another. While I would argue this is the course of the narrative in some of these stories, the Yellow Wallpaper included, it's not a universal truth throughout the collection, with many of the stories depicting women facing unadulterated tragedy that isn't rectified or made up for in some way. But why were these stories collected and republished by Showalter in the early 1990s? While many of the ideas presented in the collection about women's rights and freedoms might seem commonplace today, these were radical concepts at the turn of the 20th century. The writers included in the collection were often published in highly controversial or racy literary magazines such as the Yellow Book, and, as Showalter tells us, many of them were famous, even notorious, in their own day. But despite the stir they caused, these women have largely gone under the radar, often overshadowed, as Showalter argues, by their male contemporaries like Oscar Wilde or Joseph Conrad. Showalter aims to reintegrate these women into the canon as important literary figures and to give their work the attention it deserves. As Showalter tells us, you could read these stories in a way that provides a feminist perspective on issues of sexuality, aesthetics, decadence, and quest. They are the missing links between the great women writers of the Victorian novel and the modern fiction of Mansfield, Woolf, and Stein. These writers helped to revolutionise female experience in literature, moving away from long, winding narratives and capitalising on the psychological intensity of the short story. Showalter's work seeks to bring these women and their medium into the spotlight, and this, in turn, can help us as readers identify and reappraise female writers or writers from other marginalised groups, consider the limitations of the American and English literary canons today, and perhaps challenge our own biases when it comes to our reading habits. But how do the writers included in Daughters of Decadence distill these immense concepts and ideas down into the short story format? With all that context in mind, let's turn to some analysis and have a look at The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Gilman was born in Connecticut in 1860. She was married to Charles Walter Stetson in 1884 and gave birth to a daughter in 1885, after which she suffered from a bout of acute depression. She sought treatment from one Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, a man who was, at the time, touted as America's leading expert in women's mental health, and who prescribed to Gilman his rest cure, a treatment predominantly used to aid a nervous disorder known as neurasthenia. Now, a word on these nervous disorders. As Showalter tells us, during 1870 to 1910, just as women were starting to rally for better rights, the female nervous disorders of anorexia nervosa, hysteria, and neurasthenia became epidemic, and the Darwinian nerve specialist arose to dictate proper feminine behaviour and to differentiate treatments for nervous women of various classes and backgrounds. Funny that just as women are becoming ambitious and informed in new ways, that these illnesses become so prominent. The nervous disorders Showalter outlines were often interlinked. The protagonist of The Yellow Wallpaper, for example, is described by her husband as having slight hysterical tendencies, though we might argue she's specifically suffering from neurasthenia, a different nervous disorder that was believed to target refined, middle-class women. And some physicians, Showalter argues, regarded anorexia as one of the manifold forms of hysteria. Now, hysteria itself had for centuries been the quintessential female malady, the very name of which derived from the Greek hysteron, or womb, but between 1870 and World War I, the golden age of hysteria, it assumed a particularly central role in psychiatric discourse and in definitions of femininity and female sexuality. By the end of the century, hysterical had become almost interchangeable with feminine in literature, where it stood for all extremes of emotionality. To a lot of doctors, hysteria was the disease of less refined, more vindictive, morally degenerate women. Neurasthenic patients, like the protagonist in The Yellow Wallpaper, were treated differently. As Showalter tells us, unlike the disagreeable and disliked hysterics, neurasthenics were thought to be cooperative, ladylike, and well-bred. It was also less of a woman's disease, you could argue. Men suffer from neurasthenia too, and in men it was often believed to be caused by career pressure and being overworked. But, as I've already suggested, men were generally considered naturally predisposed to this kind of competitive environment that brought with it intellectual or professional stress. Women were not. Weir's rest cure, prescribed to Gilman, was the go-to treatment for neurasthenic patients. It was prescribed more for women than men. Weir saw the rest cure as particularly suited to treating women partly because he thought a woman tolerated a lack of stimulation and inactivity better than men. He also saw it as corrective for women who were overly active socially and physically. Treatment essentially amounted to abstaining from any activity. Any stimuli, from socialising to thinking too much, had to be snuffed out. The rest cure was isolating. And again, there are some parallels between this kind of treatment and the purity and inherent goodness of the neurasthenic and the depictions of consumptive patients less than a century previous. The neurasthenic woman was a model of ladylike deportment and hyper-femininity. She was incorporeal, a paradigm of that wasting beauty that the late Victorians found so compelling, and which early Victorians and Georgians also found compelling and titillating in their consumptive women. Now, while my mind immediately screams the rest cure sounds like a form of horrid, isolating torture that didn't address the many issues at hand, like the fact that women were maybe struggling because of their limited roles in society and their lack of power and autonomy over their lives, minds and bodies, there were some women for whom the rest cure and the removal of stimuli seemed to offer an effective cure. Charlotte Perkins Gilman was not one of those women. In 1890, Gilman wrote The Yellow Wallpaper in response to her overwhelmingly negative experiences of the rest cure. The story was published in 1892, and much later in 1913, Gilman published a short article explaining the inspiration behind it. She writes, "For many years, I suffered from a severe and continuous nervous breakdown tending to melancholia and beyond. During about the third year of this trouble, I went in devout faith and some faint stir of hope to a noted specialist in nervous diseases, the best known in the country, that was Mitchell. This wise man put me to bed and applied the rest cure, with solemn advice to live as domestic a life as far as possible, to have but 2 hours intellectual life a day, and never to touch pen, brush, or pencil again as long as I lived. This was in 1887. I went home and obeyed those directions for some 3 months, and came so near the borderline of utter mental ruin that I could see over. Then, using the remnants of intelligence that remained, and helped by a wise friend, I cast the noted specialist's advice to the winds, and went to work again. Work, the normal life of every human being. Work in which is joy and growth and service, without which one is a pauper and a parasite, ultimately recovering some measure of power. Being naturally moved to rejoicing by this narrow escape, I wrote The Yellow Wallpaper and sent a copy to the physician who so nearly drove me mad. Many years later, I was told that the great specialist had admitted to friends of his that he had altered his treatment of neurasthenia since reading The Yellow Wallpaper. It was not intended to drive people crazy, but to save people from being driven crazy, and it worked. The story itself is told from the perspective of a young woman who is suffering some kind of nervous breakdown, likely neurasthenia, after the birth of her child. Her husband, a doctor, effectively prescribes her with a rest cure by moving the whole family into an isolated house in the English countryside and encouraging his wife to spend the summer doing very little. He chooses, for their bedroom, the room in which his wife is to spend pretty much all of her time, the attic, which is covered in yellow wallpaper. The story follows the narrator's obsession with this wallpaper as she becomes aware of a woman living behind it, and the narrative shows her descent into a state of mental instability. But I think it's also possible to offer an alternate reading of the protagonist's changing state of mind. It's arguable that what the protagonist finds as she becomes more and more obsessed is a form of empowerment. Is the story a warning about the dangers of locking women up, taking away anything that stimulates them and forcing them to rest? Is it a depiction of sisterhood and empowerment that leaves the husband and not the wife undone? I'd say it's both. Let's first take a look at the way Gilman structures the narrative. It's a first-person narrative told by an unnamed narrator, at least until the end of the story, probably we'll get to that. And her story takes the form of a private diary. Through reading these diary entries, we learn that the protagonist is hiding them, and the fact she is writing at all, from her husband, John. There comes John, and I must put this away. He hates to have me write a word. Her own relationship to writing is conflicted. In one entry, she says, I don't know why I should write this. I don't want to. I don't feel able. And I know John would think it absurd. But I must say what I feel and think in some way. It is such a relief. She laments that if I were only well enough to write a little, it would relieve the press of ideas and rest me, suggesting that writing offers the potential for healing, but also that she needs to attain a certain level of health in order to write, a vicious cycle. But also, let's not forget that she is writing, so what she's saying also becomes a wry, astute, and tongue-in-cheek comment on her own writing process. Another interesting way Gilman uses the diary form is by exploiting the enticing, titillating potential of private writing. As readers, we feel as though we're accessing something we shouldn't. We're reading the private, personal diary of a woman who is keeping these thoughts from those closest to her. Gilman makes us into voyeurs, privileged with this view into the protagonist's experiences. Experiences framed as a private diary, entries not meant for publication. We become intimately associated with the protagonist, and it almost feels like she's trusting us with her innermost thoughts and feelings. After spending many nights observing the woman behind the wallpaper, the protagonist realises that this woman gets out in the daytime, and I'll tell you why. Privately, I've seen her. I can see her out of one of my windows. She reaffirms and emphasises that she's telling us this privately, reminding us that we are privy to classified information. But crucially, she doesn't tell us everything, and she makes sure we know it. Not long after confiding in us privately, she writes, I found out another funny thing, but I shan't tell it this time. It does not do to trust people too much. We, as readers, now know that we're not getting the full picture. Some things will remain hidden from us, and this is what's so incredibly thrilling about Gilman's use of the diary form. The realisation, on the part of the reader, that we'll always be in the dark. Now, let's take a look at the protagonist herself, her relationship with her husband, and with that yellow wallpaper. The protagonist's medical concerns are routinely dismissed by her husband. Only a few lines in and she tells us, he does not believe I'm sick. And what can one do? If a physician of high standing and one's own husband assures friends and relatives that there is really nothing the matter with one but temporary nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency, what is one to do? This feels far too familiar a narrative. Even in our contemporary society, women's medical issues being dismissed is all too common, the average 8-year-long waiting period for an endometriosis diagnosis being a prime example. John dismisses his wife's suffering as a slight hysterical tendency, as I've already touched on, and as well as this, the way he interacts with her is just creepy. When she tries to tell him that her health isn't improving by being holed up in the attic, he's super patronising and dismissive. Bless her little heart, said he with a big hug. She shall be as sick as she pleases. This is awful on several counts, not least because he refers to her in the third person while talking to her, uses language that infantilises her, and implies she is choosing to remain unwell. He continues to dismiss her concerns by insisting that she is better, and when she tries to suggest her mental health is worsening, he becomes borderline aggressive. Really, dear, you are better. Better in body, perhaps, I began, and stopped short, for he sat up straight and looked at me with such a stern, reproachful look that I could not say another word. My darling, said he, I beg of you, for my sake and for our child's sake, as well as for your own, that you will never for one instant let that idea enter your mind. There is nothing so dangerous, so fascinating to a temperament like yours. It is a false and foolish fancy. Can you not trust me as a physician when I tell you so? Ugh. So, her mental health is false and foolish. He causes her to retreat into silence. He places himself first in the order of importance. Don't entertain these thoughts for my sake, then the child, and then, at the very bottom of the list, her own. So, in her enforced silence, the protagonist finds an odd kind of fortitude in the wallpaper. So, of course, I said no more on that score, and we went to sleep before long. He thought I was asleep first, but I wasn't, and lay there for hours trying to decide whether that front pattern and back pattern really did move together or separately. Now, before I explain why I think there's something oddly empowering about the protagonist's lack of response and her engagement with the wallpaper, a word on the wallpaper itself. Her first description of the wallpaper is as follows. I never saw a worse wallpaper in my life. One of those sprawling, flamboyant patterns committing every artistic sin. It is dull enough to confuse the eye in following, pronounced enough to constantly irritate and provoke study, and when you follow the lame, uncertain curves for a little distance, they suddenly commit suicide, plunge off at outrageous angles, destroy themselves in unheard of contradictions. The colour is repellent, almost revolting, a smouldering, unclean yellow. We get an immediate sense of the aliveness of this wallpaper, as though it's a living organism that changes and shifts of its own accord. It's a dull yet lurid orange in some places, a sickly sulphur tint in others. The use of personification gives the wallpaper human agency.
Are you alive?
With patterns that destroy themselves, colours that are smouldering, motherfucker, movement and destructive potential. The reference to suicide, the constant irritation, the unheard of contradictions that seem to offer nothing but confusion, despair and endless torment, speak to the theme of mental illness and postnatal depression that characterise the story. And these themes and ideas become even more pronounced as the narrative continues. This paper looks to me as if it knew what a vicious influence it had. There is a recurrent spot where the pattern lolls like a broken neck and two bulbous eyes stare at you upside down. So again, we've got those themes of suicide and madness, and the idea that the wallpaper has its own agency. There are some descriptions of the wallpaper patterns that really work to challenge the reader's imagination too. The sprawling outlines, slanting waves of optic horror, like a lot of wallowing seaweeds in full chase. seaweed in full chase. What does that mean? It's difficult, if not impossible, for the reader to conceptualise exactly what this wallpaper looks like. The narrative leaves it unclear, meaning that we come to share in the uncertainty and confusion that the wallpaper evokes for the protagonist. Now, she definitely becomes obsessed with the wallpaper, but I'd argue that it also offers her some kind of escape from the crushing confines of her marriage. So when she says, "He thought I was asleep first, but I wasn't, and I lay there for hours trying to decide whether that front pattern and the back pattern really did move together or separately," there's a sense that she's undermining his authority. He wants her to rest, to sleep as he is, but she's awake, following the pattern of the wallpaper and effectively becoming less and less connected to him, to her responsibilities as an obedient wife and dutiful mother. The wallpaper comes first. And this, to me, becomes a form of sisterhood when the protagonist starts seeing the woman in the pattern behind the wallpaper. As she tells us, at night, in any kind of light, in twilight, candlelight, lamplight, and worst of all by moonlight, the wallpaper becomes bars. The pattern outside, I mean, and the woman behind it is as plain as can be. This woman only seems visible in the wallpaper at night, stooping down and creeping about behind that pattern, and the protagonist certainly finds her unsettling. But night by night, as she watches the woman creep,
it's never gonna happen.
She writes, "I'm
is
feeling
it?
ever so much better. I don't sleep much at night, for it is so interesting to watch developments, but I sleep a good deal in the daytime." Not long after, she makes another discovery, that the front pattern does move, and no wonder,
the most fucking crazy round ever. I can't do 21 flawless.
And she crawls around
this
fast,
whole time.
and shakes it all over. The protagonist watches as the woman shakes at the bars and tries and fails to climb through them. There's a sense of kinship between protagonist and the woman or women trapped in the wallpaper.
It was the end of the
She watches as they
round.
creep around outside in the daylight, is consumed by their movements at night until...
Oh my god.
The narrative takes this turn.
I really thought this was going to be the run. As soon as I saw that barrier breached.
I wonder if they all come out of the wall.
Oh my
I suppose I
god.
shall have to get back behind the pattern when it comes night. And that is hard. It is so pleasant to be out in this great room and creep around as I please. I don't want to go outside, for outside you have to creep on the ground, and everything is green instead of yellow. Now, you could definitely argue that the protagonist's integration into the wall symbolises her descent into mental instability that could have been avoided had she been listened to and allowed to live her life more freely, had her slight hysterical tendency been treated differently and not with a rest cure. When she says she doesn't want to go outside, you could argue that she's been locked away so long she is now unable to function in society. This story is a warning against treating women in this way. Hell, that's what Gilman tells us the narrative is
Wait,
about.
why am I six boarding? Oh my.
When I first read the story, I felt a sense of empowerment in the
I'm
progression
not
of the
meant to
narrative.
six
Her
board
not
on
wanting to go outside and her assertion that in this room she can
fucking
creep around
idiots.
suggests she has found autonomy, has found a form of sanctuary that is hers alone. She refers to the wallpaper as my wallpaper earlier in the story. What I like is the protagonist's willfulness. The fact she doesn't do what her husband wants her to do, nor what society would deem acceptable. I think this is best illustrated at the very end of the story, which I think it's worth quoting in full. So for context, she's locked John out of the attic room and he's trying to enter. "Why, there's John at the door. It's no use, young man. You can't open it." How he does call and pound. Now he's crying for an axe. It would be a shame to break down that beautiful door.
This
"John,
game
dear,"
is
said
so
I in the
bad.
gentlest voice. "The key is down by the front steps, under a plantain leaf." That silenced him for a few moments. Then he said, very quietly indeed, "Open the door, my darling." "I can't," said I. "The key is down by the front door under a plantain leaf." And then I said it again, several times, very gently and slowly, and said it so often that he had to go out and see, and he got it, of course, and came in. He stopped short by the door. "What's the matter?" he cried. "For God's sake, what are you doing?" I kept on creeping just the same, but I looked at him over my shoulder. "I've got out at last," said I, "in spite of you and Jane, and I pulled off most of the paper, so you can't put me back." Now, why should that man have fainted? Well, he did, and right across my path by the wall, so that I had to creep over him every time. So, there's a lot to examine here. Ultimately, for me, this ending reads as empowering rather than distressing. The protagonist seems to have taken control of her own life, and she demonstrates some mastery over her husband's. Where John repeatedly infantilised her, calling her little girl, now she infantilises him, calling him young man. John becomes the hysterical one, crying for an axe, pounding at the door. He can't seem to comprehend what's happening, letting his emotions get the better of him. The protagonist uses her gentlest voice to address him and is forced to repeat herself as though giving instructions to a child. When she tells him where to find the key, her response silenced him, just as he silenced and interrupted her repeatedly throughout the story. Crucially, once he enters the room, John faints, a historically, stereotypically feminine thing to do. So we've got a sense of role reversal here. John's dismissiveness, his patronising and infantilising language, the way he silences his wife, are all turned around on him. He's a hot mess. Does this then leave the protagonist in control? Well, she's free of the confines of her former life, in spite of you and Jane, she says. Now, this in itself is interesting. You might be wondering, who's Jane? Some critics have argued that Jane is a misprint and should read Jenny, which is the name of John's sister who has been keeping the house and who crops up in the narrative a few times. Others argue that Jane is the thus far unnamed protagonist's name. As Elaine R. Hedges argues, it could be that Gilman is referring here to the narrator herself, to the narrator's sense that she has gotten free of both her husband and her Jane self, free, that is, of herself as defined by marriage and society. So our protagonist has become something new. She's a new woman, you could say. She's calm and clear, and seems to take command of her emotions with ease. When she says it would be a shame to break the door down, she's not overreacting, she's not hysterical. It would be a shame, but it's not a big deal. Her actions and behaviour, too, show a conscious rejection of societal expectations placed on women. John has to follow her instructions in order to gain entry into the room. When he does enter, she addresses him by throwing him a look over her shoulder, refusing to give him a full attention as might be expected. Her physicality is unladylike. She is creeping around the room, a word that suggests something antithetical to the graceful, elegant, upright manner in which she ought to comport herself. And the way I imagine she moves is really funny, and I love that she seems to have just stopped caring what people think of her. And the very last line, when John has fainted and he's lying on the floor blocking her path, she just creeps right on over him. He's an obstacle, but he no longer possesses the force to control her. She can move on without him. After so much hardship and suffering, the protagonist is finally free. She's rid herself of societal expectations and social pressures, she's peeled off most of the wallpaper she so disliked, and she's found a new sense of self in her kinship with the other oppressed women she sees in the walls, in the world. She is sure to tell John that he can't put her back, and that she got out at last. This ending can also be very convincingly read as the protagonist's final descent into madness. Showalter herself writes that the protagonist escapes into madness. Her triumph over the rest cure comes at the price of her mind. But for me personally, that wasn't the overriding feeling I was left with when finishing the story. And that's the beauty and variety of literary interpretation. Gilman uses her own experience of suffering under the rest cure, of having her health and well-being censored and dictated by men, as the central theme of her narrative. The yellow wallpaper challenges ideas of Victorian domesticity, women's medical rights, the role of motherhood, women's mental health, as well as the subordination of women in society in general. And for all these reasons, you could argue, Gilman's story epitomises many of the key ideas symbolised by the new woman. But what do you think? Can the yellow wallpaper be read as a form of female empowerment? Is it, at its heart, a tragic depiction of mental illness or an unusual representation of female autonomy, or both? And what are the other stories in the collection? How might they compare? Please let me know in the comments. I'd be really interested to know what you think. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.
Oh.
And capitalising.
Capitalising.
These writers helped to revolutionise.
Come on.
Moving away from long, winding narratives and capitalising.
Capitalising.
Very nice. There's the bus. The bus.
At Miss Harper's feet, the snake moved blindly, clattering against a dollhouse where the tiny people inside stirred, and against a set of blocks which fell and crashed. Then Miss Harper saw the big, beautiful doll sitting on a small chair, the doll with long golden curls and wide-lashed blue eyes and a stiff organdy party dress. As Miss Harper held out her hands in joy, the doll opened her eyes and stood up. "Rosabelle," Miss Harper cried out. "Rosabelle, it's me." The doll turned, looking widely at her, smile painted on. The red lips opened and the doll quacked, outrageously, a flat, slapping voice coming out of that fair mouth. "Go away, old lady," the doll said. "Go away, old lady, go away." Miss Harper backed away, staring. The clown tumbled and danced, mouthing at Miss Harper. The snake flung its eyeless head viciously at her ankles, and the doll turned, holding her skirts, and her mouth opened and shut. "Go away," she quacked. "Go away, old lady, go away." The inside of the closet was all alive. A small doll ran madly from side to side. The animals paraded solemnly down the gangplank of Noah's Ark. A stuffed bear wheezed asthmatically. The noise was louder and louder, and then Miss Harper realized that they were all looking at her hatefully and moving toward her. The doll said, old lady," and stepped forward. Miss Harper slammed the closet door and leaned against it. Behind her, the snake crashed against the door, and the doll's voice went on. Crying out, Miss Harper turned and fled, but the closet was on the wrong side, and she turned the wrong way and found herself cowering against the far wall with the door impossibly far away, while the closet door slowly opened and the doll's face, smiling, looked for her. Miss Harper fled. Without stopping to look behind, she flung herself across the room and through the door, down the hall and on down the wide, lovely stairway. "Mommy," she screamed. "Mommy, Mommy." Screaming, she fled out the door. "Mommy," she cried, and fell, going down and down into the darkness, turning, trying to catch on to something solid and real, crying. "Look, lady," the bus driver said. "I'm not an alarm clock. Wake up and get off the bus." "You'll be sorry," Miss Harper said distinctly. "Wake up," he said. "Wake up and get off the bus." "I intend to report you," Miss Harper said. Pocketbook, gloves, hat, suitcase. "I'll certainly report you," she said, almost crying. "This is as far as you go," the driver said. The bus lurched, moved, and Miss Harper almost stumbled in the driving rain, her suitcase at her feet, under the sign reading, Ricketts Landing. The end.
Yeah, you thinking that it was over.
Welcome to Windy Night Stories. Tonight's story is by Shirley Jackson, The Man in the Woods. Wearily, moving his feet because he had nothing else to do, Christopher went on down the road, hating the trees that moved slowly against his progress, hating the dust beneath his feet, hating the sky, hating this road, all roads, everywhere. He had been walking since morning, and all day the day before that, and the day before that, and the days before that, back into the numberless line of walking days that dissolved, seemingly years ago, into the place he had left once before he started walking. This morning he had been walking past fields, and now he was walking past trees that mounted heavily to the road and leaned across, bending their great old bodies toward him. Christopher had come into the forest at a crossroads, turning out of the forest road as though he had a choice, looking back once to see the other road, the one he had not chosen, going peacefully on through fields, in and out of towns, perhaps even coming to an end somewhere beyond Christopher's sight. The cat had joined him shortly after he entered the forest, emerging from between the trees in a quick, shadowy movement that surprised Christopher at first and then, oddly, comforted him, and the cat had stayed beside him, moving closer to Christopher as the trees pressed insistently closer to them both, trotting along in the casual acceptance of human company that cats exhibit when they are frightened. Christopher, when he stopped once to rest, sitting on a large stone at the edge of the road, had rubbed the cat's ears and pulled the cat's tail affectionately, and had said, "Where are we going, fellow? Any ideas?" And the cat had closed his eyes meaningfully and opened them again. "Haven't seen a house since we came into these trees," Christopher remarked once later to the cat, squinting up at the sky. He had added, "Going to be dark before long." He glanced apprehensively at the trees so close to him, irritated by the sound of his own voice in the silence, as though the trees were listening to him and, listening, had nodded solemnly to one another.
Oh, couch.
"Don't worry," Christopher
This is
said
one of the best fast
"Road's
rooms
got
of
to
all
go
time.
somewhere."
It has to
It was
be.
not much later, an hour
I'm
before dark,
playing
that
21
Christopher
flows
and the cat
section in the
paused,
backyard
surprised,
too.
at a turn in the road because a house was ahead. A neat stone fence ran down to the road. Smoke came naturally from the chimneys. The doors and windows were not nailed shut, nor were the steps broken or the hinges sagging. It was a comfortable-looking, settled old house, made of stone like its fence, easily found in the pathless forest because it lay correctly, compactly, at the end of the road, which was not a road at all, of course, but merely a way to the house. Christopher thought briefly of the other way, long before, that he had not followed, and then moved forward, the cat at his heels, to the front door of the house. The sound of a river came from among the trees. The river knew a way out of the forest, because it moved along sweetly and clearly, over clean stones and, unafraid, among the dark trees. Christopher approached the house as he would any house, farmhouse, suburban home,
What's
or
a good
apartment,
description for a river?
and knocked politely and with pleasure on the warm front door. "Come in, then," a woman said as she opened it, and Christopher stepped inside, followed closely by the cat. The woman stood back and looked for a moment at Christopher, her eyes searching and wide. He looked back at her and saw that she was young, not so young as he would have liked, but too young, seemingly, to be living in the heart of the forest. "I've been here for a long time, though," she said, as if she'd read his thoughts. Out of this dark hallway, he thought, she might look older. Her hair curled a little around her face, and her eyes were far too wide for the rest of her, as if she were constantly straining to see in the gloom of the forest. She wore a long green dress that was gathered at her waist by a belt made of what he subsequently saw was grass woven into a rope. She was barefoot. While he stood uneasily inside the door, looking at her as she looked at him, the cat went around the hall, stopping curiously at corners and before closed doors, glancing up, once, into the unlighted heights of the stairway that rose from the far end of the hall. "He smells another cat," she said. "We have one." "Phyllis," a voice called from the back of the house, and the woman smiled quickly, nervously, at Christopher and said, "Come along, please. I shouldn't keep you waiting."
Beautiful.
He followed her to the door at the back of the hall, next to the stairway, and was grateful for the light that greeted them when she opened it. He was led directly into a great warm kitchen, glowing with an open fire on its hearth, and well lit, against the late afternoon dimness of the forest, by 3 kerosene lamps set on the table and shelves. A second woman stood by the stove, watching the pots that steamed and smelled maddeningly of onions and herbs. Christopher closed his eyes, like the cat, against the unbelievable beauty of the warmth, light, and the smell of onions. "Well," the woman at the stove said with finality, turning to look at Christopher. She studied him carefully, as the other woman had done, and then turned her eyes to a bare whitewashed area, high on the kitchen wall, where lines and crosses indicated a rough measuring system. "Another day," she said. "What's your name?" the first woman asked Christopher, and he said Christopher without effort, and then, "What's yours?" "Phyllis," the young woman said. "What's your cat's name?" "I don't know," Christopher said. He smiled a little. "It's not even my cat," he went on, his voice gathering strength from the smell of the onions. "He just followed me here." "We'll have to name him something," Phyllis said. When she spoke, she looked away from Christopher, turning her overlarge eyes on him again only when she stopped speaking. "Our cat's named Grimalkin." "Grimalkin," Christopher said. "Her name," Phyllis said, gesturing with her head toward the cook. "Her name's Aunt Sissy." "Circe," the older woman said doggedly to the stove. "Circe I was born, and Circe I will have for my name till I die." Although she seemed, from the way she stood and the way she kept her voice to a single note, to be much older than Phyllis, Christopher saw her face clearly in the light of the lamps. She was vigorous and clear-eyed, and the strength in her arms when she lifted the great iron pot easily off the stove and carried it to the stone table in the center of the kitchen surprised Christopher. The cat, who had followed Christopher and Phyllis into the kitchen, leaped noiselessly onto the bench beside the table, and then onto the table. Phyllis looked warily at Christopher for a minute before she pushed the cat gently to drive him off the table. "We'll have to find a name for your cat," she said apologetically as the cat leaped down without taking offense. "Kitty," Christopher said helplessly. "I guess I always call cats Kitty." Phyllis shook her head. She was about to speak when Aunt Sissy stopped her with a glance, and Phyllis moved quickly to an iron chest in the corner of the kitchen, from which she took a cloth to spread on the table, and heavy stone plates and mugs, which she set on the table in 4 places. Christopher sat down on the bench with his back to the table to indicate clearly that he had no intention of presuming that he was sitting at the table but was on the bench only because he was tired, that he would not swing around to the table until invited warmly and specifically to do so. "Are we almost ready, then?" Aunt Sissy said. She swept her eyes across the table, adjusted a fork, and stood back, her glance never for a minute resting on Christopher. Then she moved over to the wall by the door, where she stood, quiet and erect, and Phyllis went to stand beside her. Christopher, turning his head to look at them, had to turn again as footsteps approached from the hall, and after a minute's interminable pause, the door opened. The two women stayed respectfully by the far wall, and Christopher stood up without knowing why, except that it was his host who was entering. This was a man toward the end of middle age. Although he held his shoulders stiffly back, they looked as if they would sag without a constant effort. His face was lined and tired, and his mouth, like his shoulders, appeared to be falling downward into resignation. He was dressed, as the women were, in a long green robe tied at the waist, and he, too, was barefoot. As he stood in the doorway, with the darkness of the hall behind him, his white head shone softly, and his eyes, bright and curious, regarded Christopher for a long minute before they turned, as the older woman's had done, to the crude measuring system on the upper wall. "We are honored to have you here," he said at last to Christopher. His voice was resonant, like the sound of the wind in the trees. Without speaking again, he took his seat at the head of the stone table and gestured to Christopher to take his place on the right. Phyllis came away from her post by the door and slipped into the place across from Christopher, and Aunt Sissy served them all from the iron pot before taking her own place at the foot of the table. Christopher stared down at the plate before him, and the rich smell of the onions and meat met him, so that he closed his eyes again for a minute before starting to eat. When he lifted his head, he could see, over Phyllis's head, the dark windows, the trees pressed so close against it that their branches were bent against the glass, a tangled crowd of leaves and branches looking in. "What will we call you?" the old man asked Christopher at last. "I'm Christopher," Christopher said, looking only at his plate or up at the window. "And have you come far?" the old man asked. "Very far." Christopher smiled. "I suppose it seems farther than it really is," he explained. "I am named Oakes," the old man said. Christopher gathered himself together with an effort. Ever since entering this strange house, he had been bewildered, as though intoxicated from his endless journey through the trees, and uneasy at coming from darkness and the watching forest into a house where he sat down without introductions at his host's table. Swallowing, Christopher turned to look at Mr. Oakes and said, "It's very kind of you to take me in. If you hadn't, I guess I'd have been wandering around in the woods all night." Mr. Oakes bowed his head slightly at Christopher. "I guess I was a little frightened," Christopher said with a small embarrassed laugh. "All those trees." "Indeed, yes," Mr. Oakes said placidly. "All those trees." Christopher wondered if he had shown his gratitude adequately. He wanted very much to say something further, something that might lead to an explicit definition of his privileges. Whether he was to stay the night, for instance, or whether he must go out again into the woods in the darkness. Whether, if he did stay the night, he might have in the morning another such meal as this dinner. When Aunt Sissy filled his plate a second time, Christopher smiled up at her. "This is certainly wonderful," he said to her. "I don't know when I've had a meal I've enjoyed this much." Aunt Sissy bowed her head to him, as Mr. Oakes had before. "The food comes from the woods, of course," Mr. Oakes said. "Circe gathers her onions down by the river, but naturally none of that need concern you." "I suppose not," Christopher said, feeling that he was not to stay the night. "Tomorrow will be soon enough for you to see the house," Mr. Oakes added. "I suppose so," Christopher said, realizing that he was indeed to stay the night. "Tonight," Mr. Oakes said, his voice deliberately light, "tonight I should like to hear about you, and what things you have seen on your journey, and what takes place in the world you have left." Christopher smiled. Knowing that he could stay the night, could not in charity be dismissed before the morning, he felt relaxed. Aunt Sissy's good dinner had pleased him, and he was ready enough to talk with his host. "I don't really know quite how I got here," he said. "I just took the road into the woods." "You would have to go through the woods to get here," his host agreed soberly. "Before that," Christopher went on, "I passed a lot of farmhouses in a little town. Do you know the name of it? I asked a woman there for a meal, and she turned me away." He laughed now, at the memory, with Aunt Sissy's good dinner warm inside him. "And before that," he said, "I was studying." "You are a scholar," the old man said. "Naturally." "I don't know why." Christopher turned at last to Mr. Oakes and spoke frankly. "I don't know why," he repeated. "One day I was there, in college, like everybody else, and then the next day I just left, without any reason except that I did." He glanced from Mr. Oakes to Phyllis to Aunt Sissy. They were all looking at him with blank expectation. He stopped, then said lamely, "And I guess that's all that happened before I came here." "He brought a cat with him," Phyllis said softly, her eyes down. "A cat?" Mr. Oakes looked politely around the kitchen, saw Christopher's cat curled up under the stove, and nodded. "One brought a dog," he said to Aunt Sissy. "Do you remember the dog?" Aunt Sissy nodded, her face unchanging. There was a sound at the door, and Phyllis said, without moving, "That is our Grimalkin coming for his supper." Aunt Sissy rose and went over to the outer door and opened it. The cat, tiger-striped where Christopher's cat was black, but about the same size, trotted casually into the kitchen without a glance at Aunt Sissy, went directly to the stove, then saw Christopher's cat. Christopher's cat lifted his head lazily, widened his eyes, and stared at Grimalkin. "I think they're going to fight," Christopher said nervously, half rising from his seat. "Perhaps I'd better—" But he was too late. Grimalkin lifted his voice in a deadly wail, and Christopher's cat spat, without stirring from his comfortable bed under the stove. Then Grimalkin moved in cautiously and was caught off guard by Christopher's cat. Spitting and screaming, they clung to each other briefly. Then Grimalkin ran crying out the door that Aunt Sissy opened for him. Mr. Oakes sighed. "What is your cat's name?" he inquired. "I'm terribly sorry," Christopher said, with a fleeting fear that his irrational cat might have deprived them both of a bed. Shall I go and find Grimalkin outside? Mr. Oaks laughed. He was fairly beaten, he said, and has no right to come back. Now, Phyllis said softly,
how the...
now we can call your cat
how?
Grimalkin.
How?
Now we have a name, Grimalkin, and no cat, so we can give the name to your cat. Christopher slept that night in a stone room at the top of the house, a room reached by the dark staircase leading from the hall. Mr. Oaks carried a candle to the room for him, and Christopher's cat, now named Grimalkin, left the warm stove to follow. The room was small and neat, and the bed was a stone bench, which Christopher, investigating after his host had gone, discovered to his amazement was mattressed with leaves, and had for blankets heavy furs that looked like bear skins. This is quite a forest, Christopher said to the cat, rubbing the corner of the bearskin between his hands, and quite a family. Against the window of Christopher's room, as against all the windows in the house, was the wall of trees, crushing themselves hard against the glass. I wonder if that's why they made this house out of stone, Christopher asked the cat, so the trees wouldn't push it down. All night long the sound of the trees came into Christopher's dreams, and he turned gratefully in his sleep to the cat purring beside him in the great fur coverings. In the morning, Christopher came down into the kitchen, where Phyllis and Aunt Sissy, in their green robes, were moving about the stove. His cat, who had followed him down the stairs, moved immediately ahead of him in the kitchen to sit under the stove and watch Aunt Sissy expectantly. When Phyllis had set the stone table, and Aunt Sissy had laid out the food, they both moved over to the doorway as they had the night before, waiting for Mr. Oaks to come in. When he came, he nodded to Christopher and they sat, as before, Aunt Sissy serving them all. Mr. Oaks did not speak this morning, and when the meal was over he rose, gesturing to Christopher to follow him. They went out into the hall, with its silent closed doors, and Mr. Oaks paused. You have seen only part of the house, of course, he said. Our handmaidens keep to the kitchen unless called to this hall. Where do they sleep? Christopher asked. In the kitchen? He was immediately embarrassed by his own question, and smiled awkwardly at Mr. Oaks to say that he did not deserve an answer, but Mr. Oaks shook his head in amusement and put his hand on Christopher's shoulder. On the kitchen floor, he said, and then he turned his head away, but Christopher could see that he was laughing. Circe, he said, sleeps nearer to the door from the hall. Christopher felt his face growing red, and, glad for the darkness of the hall, said quickly, It's a very old house, isn't it? Very old, Mr. Oaks said, as though surprised by the question. The house was found to be vital, of course. Of course, Christopher said, agreeably. In here, Mr. Oaks said, opening one of the two great doors on either side of the entrance, in here the records are kept. Christopher followed him in, and Mr. Oaks went to a candle that stood in its own wax on a stone table, and lit it with the flint that lay beside it. He then raised the candle high, and Christopher saw that the walls were covered with stones, piled up to make loose, irregular shelves. On some of the shelves great leather-covered books stood, and on other shelves lay stone tablets and rolls of parchment. They are of great value, Mr. Oaks said sadly. I have never known how to use them, of course. He walked slowly over and touched one huge volume, then turned to show Christopher his fingers covered with dust. It is my sorrow, he said, that I cannot use these things of great value. Christopher, frightened by the books, drew back into the doorway. At one time, Mr. Oaks said, shaking his head, there were many more. Many, many more. I have heard that at one time this room was made large enough to hold the records. I have never known how they came to be destroyed. Still carrying the candle, he led Christopher out of the room and shut the big door behind him. Across the hall another door faced them. As Mr. Oaks led the way with the candle, Christopher saw that it was another bedroom, larger than the one in which he had slept. This, of course, Mr. Oaks said, is where I have been sleeping, to guard the records. He held the candle high again, and Christopher saw a stone bench like his own, with heavy furs lying on it, and above the bed a long and glittering knife, resting on two pegs driven between the stones of the wall. The keeper of the records, Mr. Oaks said, and sighed briefly before he smiled at Christopher in the candlelight. We are like two friends, he added, one showing the other his house. But, Christopher began, and Mr. Oaks laughed. Let me show you my roses, he said. Christopher followed him helplessly back into the hall, where Mr. Oaks blew out the candle and left it on a shelf by the door, and then out the front door to the tiny cleared patch before the house, which was surrounded by the stone wall that ran to the road. Although for a small distance before them the world was clear of trees, it was not much lighter or more pleasant, with the forest only barely held back by the stone wall, edging as close to it as possible, pushing, as Christopher had felt since the day before, crowding up and embracing the little stone house in horrid possession. These are my roses, Mr. Oaks said, his voice warm. He looked calculatingly beyond at the forest as he spoke, his eyes measuring the distance between the trees and his roses. I planted them myself, he said. I was the first one to clear away even this much of the forest, because I wished to plant roses in the middle of this wilderness. Even so, he added, I had to send Circe for roses from the midst of this beast around us, to set them here in my little clear spot. He leaned affectionately over the roses, which grew gloriously against the stone of the house, on a vine that rose triumphantly almost to the height of the door. Over him, over the roses, over the house, the trees leaned eagerly. They need to be tied up against stakes every spring, Mr. Oaks said. He stepped back a pace and measured with his hand above his head. A stake, a small tree stripped of its branches will do, and Circe will get it and sharpen it, and the rose vine tied to it as it leans against the house. Christopher nodded. Someday the roses will cover the house, I imagine, he said. Do you think so? Mr. Oaks turned eagerly to him. My roses. It looks like it, Christopher said awkwardly, his fingers touching the first stake, right against the stones of the house. Mr. Oaks shook his head, smiling. Remember who planted them, he said. They went inside again and through the hall into the kitchen, where Aunt Sissy and Phyllis stood against the wall as they entered. Again they sat at the stone table and Aunt Sissy served them, and again Mr. Oaks said nothing while they ate, and Phyllis and Aunt Sissy looked down at their plates. After the meal was over, Mr. Oakes bowed to Christopher before leaving the room, and while Phyllis and Aunt Sissy cleared the table of plates and cloth, Christopher sat on the bench with his cat on his knee. The women seemed to be unusually occupied. Aunt Sissy, at the stove, set down iron pots enough for a dozen meals, and Phyllis, sent to fetch a special utensil from an alcove in the corner of the kitchen, came back to report that it had been mislaid since the last time and could not be found, so that Aunt Sissy had to put down her cooking spoon and go herself to search. Phyllis set a great pastry shell on a stone table, and she and Aunt Sissy filled it slowly and lovingly with spoonfuls from one or another pot on the stove, stopping to taste and estimate, questioning each other with their eyes. "What are you making?" Christopher asked finally. "A feast," Phyllis said, glancing at him quickly and then away. Christopher's cat watched, purring, until Aunt Sissy disappeared into the kitchen alcove again, and came back carrying the trussed carcass of what seemed to Christopher to be a wild pig. She and Phyllis set this on the spit before the great fireplace, and Phyllis sat beside it to turn the spit. Then Christopher's cat leaped down and ran over to the fireplace to sit beside Phyllis, and taste the drops of fat that fell on the great hearth as the spit was turned. "Who is coming to your feast?" Christopher asked, amused. Phyllis looked around at him, and Aunt Sissy half turned from the stove. There was a silence in the kitchen, a silence of no movement and almost no breath, and then, before anyone could speak, the door opened and Mr. Oakes came in. He was carrying the knife from his bedroom, and with a shrug of resignation he held it out for Christopher to see. Then Mr. Oakes seated himself at the table. Aunt Sissy disappeared again into the alcove and brought back a grindstone, which she set before Mr. Oakes. Deliberately, with the slow caution of a pleasant action lovingly done, Mr. Oakes set about sharpening the knife. He held the bright blade against the moving stone,
Wow!
turning the edge little by little with infinite delicacy. "You say you've come far," he said over the sound of the knife, and for a minute his eyes left the grindstone to rest on Christopher. "Quite a ways," Christopher said, watching the grindstone. "I don't know how far exactly." "And you were a scholar?" "Yes," Christopher said, "a student." Mr. Oakes looked up from the knife again to the estimate marked on the wall. "Christopher," he said softly, as though estimating the new name. When the knife was razor sharp, Mr. Oakes held it up to the light from the fire, studying the blade. Then he looked at Christopher and shook his head humorously. "As sharp as any weapon could be," he said. Aunt Sissy spoke, unsolicited, for the first time. "Sun's down," she said. Mr. Oakes nodded. He looked at Phyllis for a minute, and at Aunt Sissy. Then, with his sharpened knife in his hand, he walked over and put his free arm around Christopher's shoulder. "Will you remember about the roses?" he asked. "They must be tied up in the spring if they mean to grow at all." For a minute his arm stayed warmly around Christopher's shoulders, and then, carrying his knife, he went over to the back door and waited while Aunt Sissy came to open it for him. As the door was opened, the trees showed for a minute, dark and greedy. Then Aunt Sissy closed the door behind Mr. Oakes. For a minute she leaned against it, watching Christopher. Then, standing away from it, she opened it again. Christopher, staring, walked slowly over the open door, as Aunt Sissy seemed to expect he would, and heard behind him Phyllis's voice from the hearth. "He'll be down by the river," she said softly. "Go around and come up behind him." The door shut solidly behind Christopher, and he leaned against it, looking with frightened eyes at the trees that reached for him on either side. Then as he pressed his back in terror against the door, he heard the voice calling from the direction of the river, so clear and ringing through the trees that he hardly knew it as Mr. Oakes. "Who dares enter these my woods?" The end.
What? I maybe needed to pay more attention to that. I did not understand the story. I can't listen to some of these stories when I'm playing fucking video games. Especially ones that require more IQ. I should say executive function, not IQ. It's fucking vague statement. You're dead. You're dead. You're gonna die. Dead. It's no mind.
Welcome back to Talk to Me in Korean, everyone. I'm Hyunwoo, and this is why you might want to avoid using she after a person's name in certain occasions. You might already know that she is the word that you add after a person's name to address someone or to get their attention. We use it a lot in our essential Korean curriculum lessons, as well as in our Bibimpchat episodes. Bibimpchat is a series where you can listen to natural Korean conversations. You can also hear it very frequently in Korean dramas and movies because people call each other so-and-so she all the time, like Hyunwoo she, Kyungwon she, Seungwon she, Yeji she, etc. So when you divide the Korean language mainly into two politeness levels, formal and casual, calling somebody so-and-so she definitely falls into the formal category because you wouldn't use it with your close friend's name. But there are times that you shouldn't use it, and in fact, if you use she in the wrong situations, you might seriously offend some people, and let me tell you why. So as a general rule, you want to be careful when you use she after someone's name if they are older than you, because calling someone so-and-so she is often viewed as just giving the bare minimum respect. So for example, let's say you're 30 years old and your coworker Sumin is 40 years old, 30-40, okay? Sumin might be offended if you just called her Sumin she instead of at least calling her Sumin nim or by another more appropriate job position title like Kwajang nim or Timjang nim, and this is because Sumin was probably expecting more respect from you. Another example, you recently met some people over dinner, and there's this guy whose name is Minsu and he's a few years older than you. After the dinner, you exchanged phone numbers, and the next day you texted Minsu saying, "Hey, Minsu she, nice meeting you." Upon receiving your text, Minsu might be offended because he's older and was maybe expecting more than that from you. But if someone is addressing a group of people and calling out each participant's name, like Sonyeon she, Choi she, Yusung she, you won't mind it if the person or the speaker is younger than you and calling you so-and-so she, because it's just part of this official formal procedure. It's not personal, okay? So here's a good rule of thumb. Don't use she when the other person is expecting a rather high respect or honorific attitude from you, mainly because you're younger than them. And the reason that we address each other by saying so-and-so she in our lessons at Talking in Korean is because we're all equal partners and co-workers as Korean teachers in our video lessons and audio lessons. We don't need any hierarchy among ourselves within our video content, right?
경원 씨는 있으셨어요? 저도 승환 씨랑 비슷한 걱정.
But what about off camera? We actually use something different, which is so-and-so nim, because this sounds more respectful than she. So it's like this. If people of different ages in a group all call each other so-and-so she, the younger people will be fine with it, but the older ones might find it slightly annoying. But if everybody calls each other so-and-so nim, 누구 nim, it feels like everybody's being equally respected. So at the Talking in Korean office, we always address each other by our names plus nim. I call Yeji, Yeji nim. Seungwan calls Kyungwon nim. And this is becoming more and more common in many other workplaces too. And even outside of workplaces as well, we definitely see that people tend to prefer using so-and-so nim over so-and-so she more and more in various occasions. So the next time you hear people use she or nim after someone's name, pay extra attention to the dynamics and relationships between those people. It'll be really interesting to see. So now I hope you understand why some people might be offended when you add she to their name, and depending on your relationship with the other person, there are many titles you will need to learn in the future, like 고객님 if you're a service rep talking to a customer, or 어머님 if you're a school teacher talking to a parent, etc. But that's for a different lesson. And I'd like to thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and share it with your friends, and also check out our website at talkingkorean.com for our full systematic Korean curriculum. I'll see you there. 감사합니다. And by the way, as for what you can call me in the comments, you can choose either Hyunwoo she. I've been called Hyunwoo she for a really long time by you guys, and I'm fine with it. And Hyunwoo nim is okay, and Hyunwoo 선생님 is fine. You can just say, hey Hyunwoo, and continue typing in English, but you need to add at least she or nim or Hyunwoo 형 or Hyunwoo oppa, or it's not my favorite, Hyunwoo 아저씨 after my name. Okay? And that's it for this video. I'll see you next time.
Remix 2P. Ah, so much.
Oh, here we go.
Vector restarts.
What?
You didn't even type in the fucking dude. Oh my god.
Because you don't need the slash in plutonium. Alright, let's see power-ups.
Dude, why is that game so fucking laggy?
Probably my fault.
Dude, it feels so much worse than plutonium. What the fuck? I thought plutonium felt worse than it is.
It'll get better. You just need to let it load. Wait, let me turn
No,
this.
no, like, it's like, I have screen tearing and shit.
When do you think we should stop playing with graphic content?
I don't know. I mean, realistically, wouldn't it just, like, probably when we have to stop camping?
That's what I'm thinking.
So, like, the 50s? Like, somewhere in the 50s.
But there's gonna be times where it's worth it to turn back on for using the ray.
You could just toggle it on and off.
Yeah, I know. That's the way to optimize remix, I think. Because, like, when you throw a monkey, you can still get crawlers in, like, the 70s, so you have to turn it off. Like, it's ridiculous.
Fucking late spawner. Bro, what was that? What the fuck was that round?
Yeah, it was retarded.
That was fucking stupid.
Larry Jenkins, 2012. What
Hey guys,
inspired
what's up?
you
It's
for that name?
Larry. I don't know. I think I seen something somewhere with like a stupid name. And I was like, wait, I should name myself something. It just came to my mind. I was thinking of Jimmy Jenkins. You know Jimmy Jenkins?
Yeah, Jimmy Jenkins. That's what it reminded me of.
And I was like, okay, well, they need to think I'm like 12, so I'm gonna put 2012. Because I'd be like 13, 14, and 20 if I was born in 2012.
Mm-hmm.
I remember that I don't know who it was. I used to be friends with a guy, and he used to think that Phoenix. I know exactly who it was. I don't know if you knew who he was. He used to think that Phoenix patch did some like he used to like patch for his strafes or some shit. He said that his strafes were inhuman.
What?
Yeah, I don't know who it is. You know, like remember a guy called Suzuki?
No.
Yes.
He said no.
No. When was he around?
The Gabriel O'Neill guy?
He's not around anymore.
When was he?
Oh, it's long.
I'm gonna skip forward.
The reason you can leave that room so much is because it's remixed, by the way. If it was normal zombies, you shouldn't really leave that room to like hit boxing around and shit like we were doing. Unless you get a nuke, for sure, like. I got Ray, I'm basically set.
Actually, I need Howard and insta-kill weapon.
I have the PPSH, so I'm good. Ideally, you probably want the RPK.
Yeah.
I can hit for you, probably, if you run out of points.
We can hit for other people in Remix? What the fuck? Remix is sick.
Is that max?
Max
Nice.
ammo.
Grab that whenever. I'll grab it.
But
Just
double
focus on
max.
the box. Focus on the box. You should have picked the other one up
Yeah.
first so we could spam more.
Yeah, that's my fault.
It doesn't matter. It's good. Oh, actually, no. They can't around longer. Mod.
Oh, fuck.
Got another hit.
Hit it and then take it and I'll hit for you.
Ram?
There's a few. Yeah, see, I got that stuff.
Oh,
Here we got the max. This is pure chaos.
Why double shooting? Oh, Max. I was gonna say that to me, Max.
Alright, get ready to grab it. Get ready to grab it.
I'll grab it. Oh, got it. Okay, cool. Sick, sick, sick.
We just need to. Alright, nice.
Steady.
Maybe we'll get power box.
Should I buy QR now or?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The only way that would be bad is if we get jug box.
I need 15 points.
But all you need is an insta weapon, right? And how? I can get both of those for
I
you.
have monkeys and rare. Oh, but I have HK. I can use HK. That'll do.
Yeah,
Unless I
you
get
could.
something better.
Yeah, so you've seen how. And that shit comes in clutch, so we definitely need that.
Yeah, it does. Oh, it's hit that jug.
Oh, fuck. So I'll just hit for you. Try not to buy the Gewehr on accident.
Nice.
Alright,
That's it. I'm set up.
Yeah, we can probably go. We might get nuked. I got the Hal again.
What the fuck?
Maybe I should take it. Yeah, fuck. Wait. Why don't I take it?
You could.
Oh, here's the nuke. Here's the nuke. Here, let me hit one more. You should try to get the RPK, I think.
No, I mean HK works. So double points.
Yeah. It's just not as powerful. It has more ammo though, so. I'm gonna grab this nuke. Let's go. Here, come back here, come back here. We're gonna finish the round on Tommy. It's faster.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know why I wasn't playing with the Hal before. It's like way better, probably.
It's just like I guess less ammo. Oh shit, insta.
Nice. Yeah, because I can just use nades on the instas.
Oh wait, that's fucking true. What the fuck?
And I can just use a bit of Hal in between. I'm gonna see if I can get Teddy, because this is a bad box.
We'll wait on the stairs and.
Oh, just go, fuck. Actually, with 2 Hals, bro, that'll probably kill a fucking horde in the 70s even. Like.
Yeah, no, that would be huge actually.
I don't know why the fuck I wasn't doing that before. It's actually good that I was hitting that.
Why the fuck didn't we do that? You don't need an insta weapon. You have nades.
Well, I just didn't know how good the Hal was.
I mean, yeah, I guess I proved that last game.
I don't know. I fat fingered the monkey key.
Fine.
One thing though, we gotta play a lot faster than we did in that camp, cause like you can be spamming your ray gun. Like when I'm throwing monkeys, like you don't have to wait for them to all get together to use your ray. Like it's
yeah,
normal.
I learned that.
Like it's normal, Verruct. Here, come put a Betty back here, just on top of mine. One single one. We'll put 2 on the balcony, and then we'll put 2 sets in kitchen, and then we'll just have 1 extra. Well, I guess how many would that be? So like 2. Yeah, that's. We'll just have 2 in the room at all times. So.
Why the fuck am I watching them play? What the fuck am I doing? So many tabs open. There we go.
Mainly reading and watching things as a form of escapism. Statements like, with the stress of the last few years, it's understandable that people have wanted to distance themselves from the real world and bring a little bit more magic into their lives, have become a permanent fixture, it seems, to romantasy commentary. And because it seems like the pandemic is over but the geopolitical horrors persist, a lot of people have continued to pinpoint escapism as one of the primary factors when it comes to the success of romantasy. As recently as November 2024, The Guardian published an opinion piece titled, "Of course the girls are reading horny fairy books. It's cheaper than travel and more fun than therapy," in which the writer at one point observes, at a time when people are turning up to hospital with scurvy and when a cursory glance at the news shows the impact of climate change are here, staying home on the couch reading about dragons is about as good as a holiday. But what I think it's interesting about the article is that further down in it, the author shifts the focus from escapism from big world events to escapism from one's personal life. Of all the people I know who have read dozens of these smutty fantasy books and share the obsession, they mostly have senior jobs, stressful workloads, and significant responsibilities. I think that the second observation about escapism touches on an aspect of it that is important in my opinion, and that is that it doesn't only manifest in relation to public life. People can also want an escape from their personal reality, even when the world is not on fire. And in addition to this, trying to place escape.
I'm sorry, what the fuck are we talking about here? When the world is on fire. Do we come from the same world? This is the... This is how the world has always been. It's always been on fire. You just haven't noticed it. If you think that it's only happened in, you know, whatever conflict is trending on social media, this is crazy. For millennials, it was Iraq. Gen Z, you know, Ukraine, Palestine. This is crazy. This is crazy. This... Oh, that's not what she's saying. I really hope not. Giving off some protagonist vibes, no lie.
Escapism in a cause and effect relationship to world events like the pandemic or the genocide in Gaza or the rise of populism in the West overlooks a pretty relevant fact. Fantasy literature and its film and TV adaptations were already super popular way before any of these events took place and began to occupy such a central place in the collective consciousness. I know the finale was so bad that we all like to pretend that it
crazy
happened,
protagonist
but, like, remember
talk.
Game of Thrones? I'm sure we all do because it was the biggest show in television for years, and as this one 2019 article puts it, it opened the floodgate for a plethora of other fantasy TV shows. The show first aired in April 2011 to immediate and overwhelming success, which TV executives have been trying to replicate ever since. Between American Gods, The Wheel of Time, The Witcher, Shadow and Bone, His Dark Materials, not to mention The Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones spin-offs, the past decade of television has introduced a whole new demographic to fantasy fiction. So with this in mind, it's a little bit less surprising to me that romantasy took off in the way that it did, because it is basically blending romance, which has always been a commercially successful genre, with fantasy at a time when high fantasy TV was just coming down from its peak popularity. This is not to say that if you combine any two universally well-liked things, the result will be a guaranteed success. I like olives and I like ice cream, but I don't want to eat olive ice cream. Which brings me to the second more obvious reason. A time when high fantasy TV was just coming down from its peak popularity. This is not to say that if you combine any two universal...
Wait, am I...
Thrones spin-offs, the past decade of television has introduced a whole new demographic to fantasy fiction. So with this in mind, it's a little bit less surprising to me that romantasy took off in the way that it did, because it is basically blending romance, which has always been a commercially successful genre, with fantasy at a time when high fantasy TV was just coming down from its peak popularity.
Game of Thrones is not high fantasy. What you would consider The Witcher, I'm not that familiar. But my understanding of the trends was that these were darker fantasy, and it was showing that there's a room for a darker fantasy that isn't this high fantasy. High fantasy doesn't have to be fairy tale-esque. No. Oh, it's such a vibe-based video. Oh my god.
This is not to say that if you combine any two universally well-liked things, the result will be a guaranteed success. I like olives and I like ice cream, but I don't want to eat olive ice cream. Which brings me to the second more obvious reason why romantasy is so successful, which is that, in my opinion, fantasy media has always had an erotic and romantic dimension to it. And I don't just mean people cosplaying as their favorite fantasy character in the bedroom or hooking up at the Renaissance fair, although, you know, I don't complain. And it is true that many romantasy readers and writers have talked about the way in which these books have become safe spaces for readers to explore their own fantasies in an unapologetic way, as well as an excuse to bring up sex, which is a traditionally more taboo topic, with their partners or even their friends.
Oh,
Understanding of what a healthy sex life looks like. But when I say that the fantasy genre is inherently romantic, what I mean is that it allows for drama. In The End of Romance, the study that I mentioned earlier, the authors
That's
pointed out
so
that there are two
AIDS.
main ingredients for the creation of a compelling romance movie: obstacles and transgression. To be of interest to the reader or viewer, and one might speculate to the lovers themselves, romance must constitute a struggle against some outside force that, intentional or not, serves to separate the lovers and in other ways make difficult the progress of their love. The main examples of external forces or impediments given in this study are war and social segregation based on class or ethnicity, the classics. But they also observe that as society has thankfully evolved past certain social injustices and taboos, the opportunities for a difficult romance story have become few and far between. Although examples of racism are unfortunately not hard to find even today, interracial relationships are no longer criminalized or ostracized in the way that they used to be. Ending a marriage to enter a new relationship, although still super painful, is no longer something that will get you excommunicated from your social circle in the way that it used to do before the normalization of divorce. And when it comes to interclass relationships, at least in the West, there's basically no issue. The only recent rom-com that I can think of where the premise is that the relationship between a super rich person and an average middle class person is difficult is Crazy Rich Asians. And I think it's telling that, as the title suggests, it wasn't enough for the person to be rich, they had to be crazy rich in order for the plot to be believable. So unsurprisingly, the first finding of the End of Romance study was that since the end of World War II, the ratio of romantic comedies to romantic dramas has increased steadily as the number of plausible barriers that might keep the star-crossed lovers apart and that doom both their relationship and their health and happiness has dwindled considerably. The rom-com still had obstacles, otherwise there would be no movie, no plot. But they were no longer these great external forces. Rather, they were internal to the relationship, like a miscommunication between the lovers, or maybe one of them was not emotionally available, or maybe there's a love triangle. In any case, all of these things are a lot easier to overcome from a dramatic standpoint. Perhaps too easy. So when you take a story with an already relatively simple issue and add to it the extra layer of convenience that we are afforded today by communication technology, for example, the narrative arc of a love story becomes kind of anticlimactic. It really becomes a matter of if he wanted to, he would. And this has kind of become the unofficial refrain of modern dating culture. If they wanted to, they would. We have the communication technology, we have the time, and we have the vocabulary to talk about our emotions or whatever other issues might come up in an interpersonal relationship. Because now everyone is constantly on their phone and over communicating, and because of social media, everyone, at the very least, seems knowable.
Everyone is not on their phone. Not true. The Lulu.
Even if they're not. There has been quite a bit of discourse about this in the context of rom-coms. For example, people were talking about how movies like Serendipity wouldn't function today. The movie is about two people who spend an evening together after a chance encounter, and given that they're both in relationships, they decide that they should let the universe decide whether they should be together or not. The woman writes her name and number in a book, which she gives to a secondhand bookstore, and the man writes his on a $5 bill, which immediately gets used to pay for something. So, as the title suggests, they are hoping that a happy coincidence will bring them back together if they are meant to be. Today, this movie would be over in 10 minutes. Another rom-com trope that has become obsolete because of communication technology is the running after the other person before they board the plane or train or bus or whatever it is that they're using to leave town. Now we can just call them, and they will probably just wait for the phone to stop ringing so they can text you to ask you what you want. I recently read a novel called The Material by Camille Bordas about a group of people doing an MFA in comedy at a nameless Chicago university. And at one point in the story, the narration zooms into this one character who is the chief of the English department, and he's teaching a seminar on epiphany. He wanted to end his epiphany seminar on a light note. Discuss romantic comedies, make fun of all the running involved in romantic epiphanies. The students hadn't gotten it. When they realized they loved someone, they said, and they said this as if it happened to them once a month, they could just text them. I love this book, and I particularly love this paragraph and how well it depicts the essence of what modern dating culture is right now. The complete lack of urgency around relationships, how young people feel like love is at their fingertips and they can find it at any minute. And also the way that we now feel like we don't need to inconvenience ourselves as much to hold on to a relationship. We don't really need to show up physically because we now have the technology that mitigates the uncomfortable aspects of relationships on our behalf. This is, in my opinion, where the fantasy setting comes into play. The fantasy world strips away ease and convenience, and it reintroduces friction into the life of the character. On the more superficial level, you strip away technological convenience and force the characters to interact with each other in a different way by placing them in like a medieval looking type of society where they're not drowning in entertainment and they still have to leave the house to acquire the items needed for day-to-day life as opposed to putting in a Deliveroo order or something. In doing this, the Romantasy author opens their story back up to all of these plotting.
This video is crazy. This is not encapsulate life at all. I do agree. Yeah, she's directionary. He's right in a direction. There we go. You know what? This is hard today. It's been very hard recently.
Possibilities for meet cutes and forced proximity and miscommunication and intercepted messages and all these things that would be much harder to believe in the modern world. On a deeper level, the romantasy genre can reintroduce friction within the romantic relationship itself, because creating a completely new world with an entire magical system and social structure that involves various anthropomorphous species living side by side gives the writer free rein to imagine new social norms and constraints for the lovers to contend with and fight against. Speaking to The Guardian for an article on the romantasy boom published last year, the Canadian author Nisha J. Tully said that a key aspect of romantasy is that romance can have these world-ending stakes that you just can't get with an office rom-com. I love the whole he murdered your whole family, but you're going to fall in love, something which you can only really create in a fantasy world. Obviously, the scenario she presents here is a bit of an exaggeration, but I do think that this type of over-the-top, high-stakes, dramatic romance is something that has been completely missing from popular culture for nearly a decade. And more generally speaking, pretty much any sincere depiction of romantic love had kind of completely disappeared from popular culture. I've seen a lot of people talk about this in the context of romantic comedies. Since the release of Anyone But You, starring Sydney Sweeney and Glenn Powell in 2023, various media outlets and content creators have been celebrating what they consider to be a rom-com renaissance, and discussions about this renaissance often include an analysis of why the rom-com had kind of disappeared from cinemas in the later half of the 2010s. There is a practical reason for this, which has been written about extensively by the TV and film critic Scott Meslow in his book From Hollywood with Love. He explains that at the time, the general approach to movie making that studios operated under was to essentially throw a bunch of money at franchisable, blockbuster type productions like the superhero sagas. So on average, there was less money for mid-budget movies, of which the rom-com represented a huge percentage, and this meant that a lot of talented writers stopped working in the genre because there was nothing in it for them anymore. And because talented people weren't working on them anymore, the scripts of the rom-com that were written at the time were lower quality, which resulted in fewer big-name, cool actors wanting to be attached to these projects. And so the message that audiences received from this was that if cool actors didn't want to be attached to rom-coms anymore, then it must mean that it wasn't cool to like rom-coms. Another thing that I've seen critics and essayists talk about in the context of the disappearance of the rom-com is the rise in feminist media critique of the 2010s. In her video, Why Rom-Coms Are Not Romantic Anymore, Mina Lay refers to a Jezebel article published in 2013, which deconstructed all of the romantic storylines in the Love Actually movie through a feminist lens. I wasn't living in an English-speaking country when this article came out, so I wasn't super clued into Western online culture, but I am definitely familiar with spoofs of that one cue card scene, and I'm also familiar with the way that for a while it was a very popular thing in internet culture to deconstruct classic love stories in literature and cinema through a feminist framework. I obviously agree that this wave of feminist media critique was very much warranted. It's important to look at the way that the media we are exposed to reinforces gender stereotypes in romantic relationships and societal norms, and to question those stereotypes and norms. And it's also important to tell stories where romantic relationships are not at the center of the protagonist's life every now and then, because in real life, romantic relationships are not everything. But I also agree with the many people who in more recent years have observed that once we deconstructed the rom-com, there was no sincere depiction of romantic love to take its place. All the rom-coms that we were left with were incredibly self-aware, to the point where they seemed like they were their own existence. And the reality that they depicted was so irony-led that there seemed like there was no room for love in the world that they created. And more to the point, it seemed like romantic love was not compatible with modern life, and that the desire for a romantic relationship and companionship was not compatible with the modern woman. Which brings me back to the topic of this video, the current dating scene, women opting out of romantic relationships, and seeking comfort in romantasy novels. I don't think it's a coincidence that as the rom-com faded from cultural relevance and even became this thing that we all made fun of, romance in general became less and less of a priority in the lives of young people. That being said, I also don't want to overstate the importance of the media that we are exposed to. I'm not suggesting that suddenly when there were no more movies to model how to be in relationships, people kind of couldn't figure it out anymore. Also, as previously discussed, the reason why rom-coms as a genre got so picked apart was because some of the stories that they were depicting were built almost entirely on antiquated stereotypes about men and women anyway. But I still think that the shift in attitudes towards the rom-com of the mid to late 2010s was a sort of first fall of a domino piece towards what the dating landscape is today, which people are describing as currently suffering from.
This is crazy. It's actually a crazy video. What has the death of rom-coms really... I don't think she's put that work in. Unless I've just not been paying attention, which is also could be a factor, but... What the fuck has a rom-com got to do with the death of dating standards? It's like the most... It's like the world revolves around Hollywood. It doesn't. Actually, there are actually other places that exist that have different genres, different mediums in which they tell their stories, and therefore... you're exposed to different things, and yet this seems to be a universal thing. So conflating or pairing these things together, just doubting right now. I'm real doubt.
A nonchalance epidemic. I've seen a lot of content recently about this so-called nonchalance epidemic, a sort of
There's another made-up thing on the load of mother.
Emotional atrophy that seems to be plaguing younger millennials and Gen Z and rendering them incapable of having satisfying romantic relationships. A lot of what I've read so far describes the nonchalance epidemic as a consequence of the pandemic and the social isolation that came with it, and I agree that it was a huge factor, but I do think that there are other things preceding the pandemic that have brought us here. The most obvious of them being the introduction of dating apps as the primary mode of connecting with people with the purpose of finding romantic relationships. The apps were fun to begin with, but soon enough people started to feel the effects of how they gamified dating and became more of a tool for individuals to boost their self-esteem rather than seek actual connection.
Fun for who?
Feel unwanted and disposable. Recently there has been a lot of discussion about how dating apps are essentially failing because instead of nurturing connections between people, they're creating the illusion that there's an unlimited number of potential matches out there, which doesn't really incentivize users to make an effort to actually get to know each other. Another cultural phenomenon that started gaining traction around this time was the rise of self-improvement and hustle culture gurus who disseminated their teachings via social media and encouraged their followers to focus on themselves, which sounds good in theory, but oftentimes this particular brand of self-improvement and self-care prioritized the self in response to rejection from others. The message wasn't focus on yourself so that you can become a better person, but rather focus on yourself to become unrecognizable, to make them regret ever hurting you, to shock everyone, or to prove them wrong. In a thesis titled Neoliberal Love and the Pathology of Gen Z Singledom and published in 2023 at the University of Pennsylvania, the author Talia Feaster analyzed dating content on TikTok in an effort to better understand Gen Z attitudes to love and relationship. One of her findings, among other things, was that TikTok hyper-individualism manifests as a constant pursuit to making oneself into a more interesting package. Focus on yourself, go to the gym, learn how to do your hair and makeup better, earn more money to buy more clothes. It may appear like self-improvement, but really it is done in response to romantic disappointment and with the hope of attracting better partners in the future. Over the past few years, I've seen this type of attitude being pushed really hard by super popular dating coaches who promise their viewers that if they master what they call the art of detachment, they will somehow manifest the perfect relationship as a result. I don't chase, I attract has become a popular way of thinking on social media right now because it sounds like it's based on some greater philosophical or spiritual truth, while also conveniently sparing us the risk of putting ourselves out there and trying to pursue a relationship to then be embarrassed when that relationship attempt fails. It's very interesting how new age spiritual concepts such as manifestation and even therapy speak are constantly being molded to create new ways for people to protect themselves from getting their feelings hurt, or worse, getting embarrassed, which in the age of social media cringe is like the worst thing that could possibly happen to a person, it seems. Writer and podcaster Liz Plank recently referred to the desire to appear nonchalant as a state of emotional underfunctioning. We're living in a moment of emotional underfunctioning, a vibe shift where dating has become something closer to performance art, an endless exchange of glances and memes and left swipes, calibrated to avoid the horror of being the one who cares more. According to a Pew study, 63% of single Americans aren't even looking for a relationship. Bumble just laid off a third of its staff. Even casual hookups are in decline. We're not falling in love. We're not even trying. She continues, it's an ambient fear of vulnerability so totally omnipresent that it started to feel natural. Like love should be chill and casual and entirely unspoken. Like the only way to be safe is to never say what you want out loud. The entire romantic landscape has become one long standoff. Don't text first, don't double text, don't get too excited, don't ask too many questions, don't let anyone know that you care.
Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Now I'm hearing about some of these things. The double text thing, when I heard that come out of Yezi's mouth, I'm thinking, what? This is crazy. This is psychotic. You just say you're scared of texting twice? I'm about to send you a whole paragraph. I'm just thinking, in what practical world could you not text somebody twice? Because I'm just not online at the same time as other people. Now, that may be because I'm a netizen. I like that term, netizen. Why the Why the fuck would I not? I have things to talk about and send. Why would I not send you something in a nice package? What the fuck? I want to talk to somebody that's actually interested in things. And if you're interested in things, what does that mean? What the fuck are you doing here, pussy? If you're interested in things, you can't send something in one message or something. Pick a stream of thoughts, blah blah blah. How the you respawn in the same window? Oh, you bitch.
At least not before they do. We're not dating each other so much as running parallel simulations of desire, carefully curated to look effortless. So on the background of this emotional desert, my great overarching theory, in case you haven't figured that out by now, is that romance fiction and romantasy in particular has become so popular in direct reaction to this. A social media trend that I've seen a lot in the past year or so, both on Instagram and on TikTok, is women taking pictures of their favorite male love interest and posting them with the caption, "Bring back yearning," or something to that effect. The characters are typically male leads from classic romance stories that millennial and Gen Z women consider to represent the opposite type of relationship to the ones that they have experienced in real life. In the context of their respective novels, each of these men is uniquely dedicated to the woman that he fell in love with, usually the female protagonist, forsaking all others and continuing to love her from afar, even when she doesn't know about his feelings, or when, because of a crisis in the relationship, she has withdrawn her affection from him. A related trend is the slogan, "The best men are fictional," and other variations on this theme, through which young women highlight the dedication to love of fictional men, in contrast to that aforementioned nonchalance in modern dating. Yearning is the opposite of nonchalance, and also one of the primary components in a romantasy narrative. The examples of men on screen thus far are not from romantasy stories because there haven't been any major live actions produced yet, but the romantasy novel places itself in direct opposition to nonchalance. First and foremost, there isn't really such a thing as dating around in romantasy. There are love triangles every now and then, but they typically center around the female protagonist. She is the one who needs to make up her mind to make a choice, not the one waiting around for a choice to be made. Another characteristic of the romantasy love story is that even when the attraction between the main couple is somewhat at odds with the rules of the world that they exist within, there is still a sense that their love is destined. It's often part of a greater design and therefore guaranteed to survive every obstacle. And sometimes falling in love and being transformed by that love is even necessary to the survival of the world or society that the lovers exist within. It might be predictable, but it's cathartic, and in my opinion, also a clear reaction to the minefield of ambiguity and ambivalence that is modern dating. The satisfying, albeit formulaic nature of romantasy offers some respite from the unknowables of modern life. A key thing to note about romantasy, though, is that for all that the romantasy novel centers yearning and effort and a sincere and steadfast approach to love, it also shifts the onus of the emotional labor required to keep a relationship alive from the woman onto the man. It seems like when romantasy readers say "bring back yearning," what they mean is that they want to feel yearned for, not do the yearning themselves. This reminded me of something that gets talked about a lot in the context of heterosexual relationships and their dynamic, and that is the concept of heteropessimism. The term was first coined by Asa Saracen to describe performative disaffiliations with heterosexuality, usually expressed in the form of regret, embarrassment, or hopelessness about the straight experience. Saracen observed, "It's almost taboo, from what I've seen both online and in my real life, to express straightforward desire for men that doesn't have the caveat of being like, men are trash, or I kind of hate men." And I thought that this was interesting because recently I've seen an increasing number of women talk about this embarrassing experience of putting oneself out there and feeling like there are no good men. A distinct aspect of heteropessimism is the feeling that women are expected to single-handedly make a relationship happen by coaching the men that they are dating through their feelings about them and the relationship without scaring them away. There's a sense of embarrassment around this reflected in the thousands of pieces of content from women describing the choice to give up dating altogether because they feel exhausted by the whole process. But giving up is obviously not a one-fits-all solution. Writer and podcaster Nicole Ochran recently published an essay titled "Heterofatalism: The Politics of Waiting and Wanting," in which she observes, with calls to decenter men and practice detachment, pursue careers and hobbies, work on fitness goals, start therapy, create community, women are told to create full and enriching lives outside of their relationship status. But what do you do if you've done it all and you still want a man lying next to you at night? Because worse than being a single woman is being the single woman painted as desperate. I read a Guardian op-ed about romantasy recently, which I thought was very good at expressing that finding love is not the main aspect of the female fantasy that romantasy caters to. The romantasy novel also creates a world in which women are free from the emotional labor that they are expected to carry out in a real-life romantic relationship without having to give up on relationships altogether. The romantasy protagonist still wants to be in love. She wants sex and she wants companionship, but she also has a bunch of other things going on. The romantasy heroine speaks to the cultural moment. The strong female-led stories show young women can be nerdy and sexy, vulnerable and powerful, both not that girl and that girl. You can be Glinda and Elphaba, Chappell Roan and Taylor Swift. You can be anyone or anything you please. This is the fantasy. Whether this fantasy is something that young women should want for themselves or yet another continuation of unrealistic societal expectations for women to be everything at once is another also very interesting conversation to be had. But for this video, I just wanted to add a different perspective to the romance and romantasy literature discourse because I think that it's very tempting to just engage with this literature in terms of whether it's good or bad and not so much question why it's so popular. And more generally, I just think it's so easy to criticize the things that women like and do without actually engaging with those things. We periodically see people build entire social media careers around making fun of pick-me girls or judging which women are girls and which aren't. I've also recently noticed a new thing where women use the term male-centered as an insult for each other, and it's giving me flashbacks to not that long ago when people were using the term male gaze or for the male gaze as a pretentious way of saying that women's outfits were slutty. And this is not to say that women can't be villains or can't like or do things that are wrong, but the way that we so quickly bypass trying to understand women's preferences and behaviors and immediately move on to policing them is a little bit dystopian. It's like we just never learn anything. Anyways, I'm going to step off my soapbox now and say thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Fucking, ooh, nice and aid, by the way. Yeah, thank you. That was psychotic. They really just say that? Huh. That's why you're on round 12. Just keep talking to yourself. Fucking idiot. Bomb. Max. I'm not even tracking this on. What?
Can Shirley Jackson's writing advice help us improve our own writing? We're going to find out today. I've got a few of her thoughts and quotes about the craft, so let's get into it. Number 1. Try to remember with description that you must never just let it lie there. Nothing in your story should ever be static unless you have a very good reason indeed for keeping your readers still. The essence of the story is motion. This is something I sometimes mention in my editing work, but I haven't been saying it anywhere near as eloquently as Shirley Jackson does here. I've been saying description works better for me if something is moving, essentially. What's special about this advice, other than how actionable and accessible it is that she mentions keeping the reader still. I do really agree with her that that's what static description tends to do. That's one of the reasons it doesn't work for me when I'm reading, as well as the fact that I just don't visualize things that strongly from description. I do feel a bit paused. That's why I always feel a bit tempted to skip over it, because I want the story to keep moving. I think showing some amount of movement, no matter how small, allows the story to still feel fluid, as though it's moving forward. The movie's still playing, if you like, rather than static description, making it feel like the author just hit pause for a second right when you were getting into it. However, I do want to state, like I often try to do, that this is just my opinion, this is just my preference. It's no more valid than yours because every reader and writer is different. On that note, if you're new here, my name's Kieran, I'm a writer and a freelance editor. I love to help writers tell their stories and have fun doing it. Number 2, a writer who's serious and economical can store away small fragments of ideas and events and conversations and even facial expressions and mannerisms and use them all someday. I included this tip because long-time viewers of this famous author's advice series will recognise it. It seems like almost every author I cover, and check the description for a full playlist of all of them by the way, includes their own take on this concept. Neil Gaiman calls it his compost heap, Murakami calls it his garage. And don't comment about how I said garage, by the way. I'm British and Northern, that's how we say it. I think the reason this concept is such a common occurrence, though, among famous authors is because it works.
I can double down there.
Sparks of an idea. If the way someone says something to you stands out, or the way the light touches something on your way to work in the morning, remember it. If you have a way to, record it, keep it, add it to that vault in your mind for later use, because it's so much easier to pull from a store of sparks and ideas you already have than it is to create something from nothing. We can create from nothing because that's what we do, but it's just harder. Number 3, use all your seasonings sparingly. Do not worry about making your character shout, intone, exclaim, remark, shriek, reason, holler, or any such thing, unless they're doing it for a reason. All remarks can be said. Every time you use a fancy word, your reader's going to turn his head to look at it going by, and sometimes he may not turn his head back again. I like this a lot, because she isn't, as is often the case, telling us to never ever do this. She's just suggesting we do it sparingly. I've heard both sides of this argument many times. One side says, don't use anything other than said. The other side says, how are the audience supposed to know if a character whispered if you don't tell them? Personally, I sit more towards the just use said side, but like Shirley Jackson says, if you have a reason to use those other words, use them, and don't worry about it. There's only an issue, as far as I can see, when the dialogue starts to be littered with them. Yes, John shouted. I agree, Sarah remarked. That does get a little bit grating to read because it feels too direct. The author, to me, is a little bit too present.
I'm so
giving the reader space to interpret, I think,
what the fuck was that?
Characters' voices as they want to, except for when you know something, they don't, and you just have to.
I'm done with
whispers,
this.
for example, those sudden screams in an otherwise calm scene when something unexpected happens. I suggest leading your language by what's happening in your scene. If said will work, use it. If there's some real, credible reason why it won't work, then use whatever you need to. I'm just interrupting myself for a second to let you know that, as planned,
is that his own advice or was that hers?
Project Ventus is now available, goes live today. If you're curious, links are in the description. Number 4, do not try to puzzle your reader unnecessarily. A puzzled reader is an antagonistic reader. Do not expect him to guess why a character does something or how it happens that some remark is made. It may be that you want him to stop and wonder for a minute. If so, make it perfectly clear that everything's going to be alright later on. I included this tip for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it almost directly carries on from the last one, and secondly, because this advice can really be scaled up, I think. So how does it carry on from the last one? Well, she mentioned being sparing with those dialogue tags like shouted, scream. This is the moment to use them. If there's meaning in how a character says something as well as their actual words, include that, let us know. However, this is much bigger than just the subtleties of dialogue. It's about mystery, and I love mystery. There's nothing that pulls at readers and propels them through the story quite like mystery does, in my opinion. Having something that the reader doesn't know but wants to is fuel for readers. However, that fuel is not unlimited. As writers, we need to manage that fuel reserve for readers and make sure it never runs out. Showing readers a glimpse of something out of the corner of their eye every once in a while and reminding them there's a secret, I think is good. It really works if your character doesn't know what the mystery is either, if the lack of knowledge is not solely the position that the reader themselves are in. If that state of guessing and wondering is paralleled by your characters, then the fuel, I think, just keeps replenishing itself. However, placing blocks in front of a reader and denying them knowledge just because you want to keep the secret longer, that can be frustrating. That situation burns through that fuel reserve pretty quick, and it can be annoying, I think. If all the characters know something and only the reader doesn't, they'll see through that. Then instead of being hooked on the mystery, they'll be thinking about how you, the author, are intentionally hiding something from them. And as a general rule, we don't really want readers to think about us authors much. It makes the stories a bit less immersive. Most importantly though, she said if you're using mystery, you have to make it clear that at some point the reader will get the explanation or the resolution. And I think as long as they know that, most readers will be happy to be in the dark for a while. Some readers though will read the last page of your book before they start it. Yeah, really, that's a real world example. And there is nothing that we can do about that. Number 5, always make the duller parts of your story work for you. The necessary passage of time, the necessary movement must not stop the story dead, but must move it forward. This tip gave me pause, not because I misunderstood it or disagreed with it, but more because I'm not exactly sure.
Gaga has storybook prose.
I understand what she means here, but from a practical sense, I'm not sure how I'd actually manage to make those duller parts of the story work for me. The best I feel I can do is to disguise them or improve them so that they at least don't take anything from the story. I do think it's a really good idea to be at peace with the simple, unavoidable fact that your story will have what she calls duller parts, though. Not dull parts, or bad parts, or boring bits, but bits that are just less interesting than the majority of the story, but essential to have. I have never written a story that I consider 100% gold material throughout and effective on every single page. Maybe some writers do that. I don't. Instead, my approach is to try to include something that I love in every passage of the book. A turn of phrase, an angle, a bit of description, dialogue, anything. Even those duller moments then still shine a little bit, even if it's just for me. Maybe that's kind of what she was talking about, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I ever interpret these tips quite correctly, to be honest, but hopefully these videos are still useful. If you want to check if I've made a video about your favourite author, click the playlist on the screen now, or just leave me a comment of any authors you'd like to see me cover. As always, thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.
I wish you went more in detail to the tips. It's not really that low on money. Oh my word, I thought that was breached.
Roald Dahl's been cancelled. It's those bloody Snoke Woeflakes at it again. Don't they care about history? Preserving art as it is? What gives them the right to go around making changes to classics? Where will this end?
Readers and fans are sounding off after reports that many of his books will be updated with new language.
A debate over censorship stemming from backlash to the news that new copies of his beloved children's and young adult works will be changed.
His iconic books, which have entertained millions of children around the world for decades, have received a woke makeover.
Apparently, Bahari said the estate had partnered with Inclusive Mind, an organization that champions diversity and accessibility in children's literature. The woke censorship regime is here and it is ugly.
In his book, The Witches, a paragraph explaining that witches are bald beneath their wigs ends with a new line, there are plenty of other reasons why women might wear wigs, and there is certainly nothing wrong with that.
These people know no shame.
Sanitizing, this whitewashing.
That's not factually done.
An attempt to rewrite history.
Because we now live under what is effectively a marshmallow societarianism.
Woke.
So this could be China.
Government-approved cultural diarrhea.
You might have caught wind of the drama. On the 17th of February 2023, The Telegraph published an article detailing the decision by
I might
publishers
more agree with conservatives on this
to
one.
edit the books of beloved children's author Roald Dahl. The aim of these edits, according to numerous news outlets, was to remove or adjust language that might be considered offensive to contemporary readers. To put it lightly, this caused an absolute outrage in the media, both traditional and social, to the extent that only a week after the Telegraph article was first published, on the 24th of February, Puffin announced they would be publishing the Roald Dahl Classic Collection, which won't contain the new edits, alongside the new Puffin Roald Dahl books for young readers, which do. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's settled then. Both versions are being published. People can choose which version they'd rather read or read to their children. But the initial outrage surrounding the Dahl edits raises some intriguing concerns about the ethics of writing, the value of history, and the slippery nature of censorship. Doing my research, I was struck by the incredibly aggressive response of certain news outlets. The fear repeatedly expressed that to censor a book or a franchise is a slippery slope, the premium placed on personal choice, and the powerful connection between identity, freedom, and fandom. This kind of story affects us all, whether we're Dahl fans or not, because it raises serious questions about the media we consume. So it's worth pausing over and understanding. It's worth considering the different viewpoints that make up this most passionate and vitriolic of literary debates. What is censorship? Is it ever okay to edit an author's works? What, if anything, gives us the right to rewrite? But before we tackle those big questions, it's important to understand what actually are these edits that have caused such a stir. In this article, The Rewriting of Roald Dahl, The Telegraph claims to have listed in this handy table every edit to the Dahl books made by Puffin in conjunction with Inclusive Minds, an organisation who, in their own words, work towards breaking down barriers and challenging stereotypes to ensure that every child can access and enjoy great books that are representative of our diverse
Why are you
society.
editing the book?
Clearly a hive
Just
mind
write
of
a
evil
different
authoritarian
book.
censors if ever I heard of one, but more on them later. So on the left-hand side of the table, you've got words and phrases included in the 2001 editions of the books, and on the right, you can see how they've been changed for the new editions, or you'll see the word removed where some text has been removed. I'm going to begin by saying that there are quite a few edits that, based on this table, I either don't understand the value of, or don't personally think are necessary. For example, I don't get why in George's Marvellous Medicine they changed the word ouch to ugh, and I don't understand why they removed the phrase I'll take your word for it, Sophie said, from the BFG. Then there's some violent or grotesque imagery that was altered that I don't really see as problematic, like changing she had pale brown teeth and a small puckered up mouth like a dog's bottom to she had rotting teeth and a small puckered up mouth like a dog's bottom from years of frowning. Or changing this powder, if eaten, will make the dog explode to this powder, if eaten, will make the dog hop like a flea. And I don't really understand the decision to remove the word black in this example from the BFG. Flattening his tall, thin, black cloaked body against the side of the building becomes flattening his tall, thin, cloaked body against the side of the building. And in SEO Trot, I'm not sure about the value of changing you never know, Mr. Hoppy said darkly, you never know, to you never know, Mr. Hoppy said mysteriously, you never know. I could guess at the reasoning behind these edits, but I don't fully or immediately understand them. I'm not mad about it, and I'm also aware that just because I don't personally understand some of these changes, it doesn't mean there aren't people out there who do. And I think it's important to point out here that despite the fact that most newspapers loved to fixate on the idea that these edits have been made to avoid offending people, some of them are just updates to the language, to remove words that aren't necessarily offensive, but also aren't used in contemporary vernacular as such, words that children today might not understand. And while there are some edits I don't personally see value in, there are many others that I absolutely do. Now, one thing that has cropped up time and again in criticism of the Dahl edits is that these books are products of their time. They were written decades ago, and so they include certain sentiments we don't, or shouldn't, share today. I want to put a pin in that. Let's just imagine that the words and sentences we're about to read are taken from a book first published today in 2023. Let's forget for a few minutes whether we should or shouldn't alter the works of a dead writer, whether doing so or not doing so is a slippery slope, what this could mean for the bigger picture in terms of literary and cultural censorship, which are concerns I don't want to invalidate, I understand their value. But let's start by instead having a closer look at what some of these changes actually are in and of themselves. Let's start with some examples from The Witches. There was something indecent about a bald woman was removed, and the following sentence was added. Besides, there are plenty of other reasons why women might wear wigs, and there is certainly nothing wrong with that. The word queer was changed to strange, and this sentence was removed. A boy it will be for a certainty, because girls are not keeping pet mice. So right off the bat, Dahl's use of the word queer in The Witches means strange, so changing it to strange avoids conflating queerness from a 21st century perspective with being weird or other. So yeah, I think it old-fashioned for a book published in 2023 to use queer to mean strange. A lot of the edits update language to reflect contemporary meaning, both to avoid causing offence and to incorporate words and phrases children reading today are more likely to relate to and understand. We see this kind of alteration again in Matilda, in which the school matron becomes the school nurse, thus removing the gender stereotyping surrounding the word matron and updating the term to reflect a child's experience of school today. It's an awareness of gendered language and stereotyping that seems to inform the decision to remove or edit references to baldness in The Witches. If I read this quote, casually thrown into a children's book published in 2023, I'd be concerned that it was upholding what feels like another weird, outdated stereotype, that women should have long hair and that baldness for women is somehow wrong or unnatural. The addition of this quote supports that point. The wording's a bit ham-fisted, but I get why they'd include it. A lot of the edits do this. They get rid of gender stereotyping. I'd find it odd for a book published in 2023 to assume only boys have pet mice. And I'd appreciate a book that doesn't gender place or objects. In George's Marvellous Medicine, Father's toolshed and Mummy's dressing table are replaced by the toolshed and the dressing table. Now I just need to pause this more serious assessment of the edits to reflect on one of the changes that made me laugh, child that I am, and that's the removal of the word horny. In George's Marvellous Medicine, for example, horny finger becomes bony finger. In James and the Giant Peach, James was promptly flung across the room into old green grasshopper's horny lap, was edited to get rid of the offending word. The word horny means both sexually aroused and horn-like, but today I bet more people use it to mean the former, so yeah, I can understand that one too. From a 2023 perspective, I think the less we use the word horny in children's books, the better. Across multiple books, mothers and fathers are now parents. The cloud men from James and the Giant Peach are now cloud people, and the sentence about their wives crouching over little stoves with frying pans in their hands, frying snowballs for their husbands' suppers, has been removed. The edits also do things like turn firemen into firefighters, and the Oompa Loompas are now referred to as people rather than as men. And in a book first published in 2023, these are things I would be happy to see. Fewer assumptions about gender roles, the inclusion of non-binary or genderless characters, the acknowledgement that some firefighters are not men. And if adjusting an incredibly popular children's franchise by making Oompa Loompas gender neutral helps make non-binary and agender children feel included in some way, then great. And remember, we've still got that pin in the "these books are products of their time" argument. Speaking of Oompa Loompas, another alteration is to language in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory that, you could argue, puts a weirdly positive spin on slavery. So I shipped them all over here. Every man, woman and child in the Oompa Loompa tribe becomes "so they all agreed to come over, each and every Oompa Loompa." And it was easy. I smuggled them over in large packing cases with holes in them, and they all got here safely. They all speak English now, was changed to "they've told me they love it here." You could argue that by the very nature of their role within the story, the Oompa Loompas are always going to be contentious, and to remove that contention entirely would involve rewriting the entire book. So one argument could be that the 2023 edits are pointless, because they can only modify the language. They can't remove the uncomfortable racist undercurrents that are baked right into the story. And it's not just Charlie and the Chocolate Factory that was altered in an attempt to remove a problematic depiction of race. In SEO Trot, the phrase "weird African language" is changed to "African language," and sections from the BFG were removed to get rid of this uncomfortable dialogue. Every night, unpleasant things are happening in Baghdad, the Sultan said.
Some of these edits just seem... I don't even know... If the books are problematic, remove them. I don't like the idea of somebody rewriting an author's work. That makes me really uncomfortable. It really does. That should be something for later curriculums to go, okay, this is what people used to read, and this is and this is the language that was particularly used. This is crazy to me. I don't like this at all. And also weird African language. Yeah, it assumes the African language is weird, and I don't know if it depends what age that they're reading at, but an African language could be weird to somebody that doesn't speak an African language. Going from a no gendered language or a 2-3 gendered language to, you know, a 14 gendered language, I know that's not really what's going on, but these are very queer languages for sure. How many genders in your language? Sorry. A very queer language in both senses. No, I don't know. I don't know about that one. But at least they have a classic edition, so you can actually read the real thing. Because why the fuck would I want my shit censored? I know my books are reflecting a particular time period. Write new books. Let new authors have the spotlight. I'm sure there are plenty of good children's authors that write good books that don't necessarily use gendered language in the way that Roald Dahl used. Instead of rewriting the man's books. I think that's very disgusting. I think this... Oh my goodness. Ooh.
Chopping off people's heads like you are chopping parsley. If I saw this dialogue normalised in a children's book published in 2023, I'd be shocked and concerned at the racial stereotyping. Now, you might be sat there screaming, but these books were published in 2023! That's the point! And we'll get there, I promise. Just suspend your disbelief and indulge me a while longer. Another contentious issue that the edits address is the use of the word fat and the descriptions of fat people. Now, a lot's been said about Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and the decision to change the description of Augustus Gloop from fat to enormous, and whether that's really any better. And yeah, I mean, it's not much better at all, I don't think. More than this, the reported removal of the word fat across all of Dahl's books could be perceived as tone deaf because it sweeps the word under the rug and works to reaffirm it as negative. In the name of body neutrality, isn't it better to move away from the association between fat equals unhealthy or fat equals bad? You could argue that if the edits have removed any use of the word fat, doesn't that make them part of the problem? But in a lot of these examples, the word fat isn't used in a positive or a neutral sense. Fat, in Dahl, and in many children's books, seems a resoundingly negative thing to be. Take this description of Mrs. Wormwood from Matilda. She wore heavy makeup and had one of those unfortunate bulging figures where the flesh appears to be strapped in all around the body to prevent it from falling out. Or this from James and the Giant Peach. Aunt Sponge was terrifically fat, and tremendously flabby at that. Her tummy and waist were as soggy as paste, it was worse on the place where she sat. Augustus Gloop had great flabby folds bulging out all over the place, and his face was like a monstrous ball of dough. And Mrs. Salt is described as a great fat creature with short legs, and she was blowing like a rhinoceros. The edits attempt to alter or do away with these unequivocally negative references to fatness. Now, you might be thinking, Dahl refers to mean Aunt Spiker from James and the Giant Peach in a damning rhyme too, and Spiker is skinny. In fact, she's thin as a wire and dry as a bone only drier. She was so long and thin, if you carried her in, you could use her for poking the fire. And by the way, this rhyme about Spiker was also altered in the edits. So, you could argue that it's not that Dahl is fat-shaming, as much as he is using grotesque physical extremes to illustrate the nasty personalities of James's aunts. But from looking down the list, Dahl does seem to have a penchant for equating fatness with meanness, with the unsavoury characters in his stories. As Sarah Shafi puts it, if a character's whole villainy is predicated on the fact that they have a scar or that they are overweight, then I think it's actually a case where you need to wonder what that says about us as a society and the writer's work. If I read an author's books published in 2023, and in multiple cases a character's fatness was an indicator of their negative traits or bad personality, I think that's a damaging stereotype to perpetuate. But here we go. Let's remove the pin. Roald Dahl wasn't writing in 2023. James and the Giant Peach came out in 1961, and he wrote and published most of his books in the 70s and 80s before his death in 1990. His books, therefore, are products of their time, and I think it goes without saying that that means they'll almost inevitably contain words, phrases, and stereotypes that we don't as readily publish in children's literature today. And this begs a question. Should we edit a book written in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s to appeal to our 21st century sensibilities?
No.
The answer, for a lot of people, is no.
The Thought Police have taken a meat cleaver to some of the best-loved children's stories of all time.
But removal is an obliteration of the past. Obliteration of the past is actually fundamentally an obliteration of the truth.
An attempt to rewrite history.
That is a crime against truth.
I think reading should be enjoyable, it should be fun, there is no enormous high-mindedness about it. It should be fun and great.
Soon we will never laugh at another joke. We'll never dance to another song.
Banning Jane Austen novels to decolonise universities.
Matilda reads Jane Austen rather than Rudyard Kipling. Why?
Is a child that doesn't have a parent to explain going to be given a Roald Dahl? No,
Absolutely, because they're in the library at school.
And the Oompa Loompas have gone gender neutral.
Just in case any of the small men wanted to become small women or small non-binaries.
And also, references to mother and fathers have been removed, and now changed to parents or family.
This book is so unfunny, he's actually pretty
So-called
funny.
sensitivity readers.
So-called sensitivity readers.
Who are these sensitivity readers?
Sensitivity reader.
Well, those used to be called editors.
If you're anything like me, or one of my producers even dare to change one word or even a comma in my opening monologue, they will hear the words and in an unmistakable touch it and I will kill you tone, don't touch my monologue.
Nobody is saying to children, let's watch Pulp Fiction. Everybody believes on a certain level.
What about reading the Bible? It's going to go vegan, isn't it?
Well, Hitler himself was a painter, not a very good one.
I think this has become intellectually dishonest at this point.
While some felt the edits weren't a problem and would hopefully make Dahl's writing more inclusive, the response was mostly negative. Some felt that the changes were insulting to a child's intelligence, that altering certain words to clear up and modernise the language came with the assumption that the child is too stupid to understand older phrases or words. Others argued that there are still books being published for the first time today in 2023 that are racist, sexist, and bigoted in lots of ways. So why waste time editing books of the past when books of the present are still problematic? People really like to point out that hundreds of changes have been made to the books, though a spokesperson for the publishers argued that within the context of the word count of the wider books, these textual changes are minimal. Roald Dahl's stories remained unchanged, and his mischievous spirit undiminished. Some called the edits PC gone mad. The word woke was bandied about to no end. Some argued that the very point of Roald Dahl's books is his wicked sense of humour, and that's what appeals to children. To sanitise it is to lose the essence of the storytelling that children enjoy. Piers Morgan called it
cultural vandalism,
and said the edits shamed people for using perfectly normal words, while Peter Hitchens called it a
crime against truth.
And heck, we don't want to woke those normal truth words, stop simply making the blink of an eye. Suzanne Moore, writing for the Telegraph, called the sensitivity readers. I should pause here and explain something. Almost every report on the edits refers to Inclusive Minds, who worked in conjunction with Puffin on the edits, and their band of sensitivity readers, a term which has gleaned much mockery. But, according to Inclusive Minds, they are not sensitivity readers. If a sensitivity reader is someone who reads a literary work, looking for perceived offensive content, stereotypes, and bias, creating a report for an author or publisher with suggested changes, Inclusive Minds offers the service of inclusion ambassadors, whose role it is to share nuances related to their lived experience as characters are created and plots are developed. This makes it very different from sensitivity reading. Involving our ambassadors is not about cutting potentially controversial content, but rather about including and embedding authenticity and inclusive voices and experiences from the outset. So, regardless of what you think about sensitivity readers or inclusion ambassadors, what we might deduce from this is that it wasn't the job of Inclusive Minds to comb through Dahl for offensive terms. It sounds like their job was to discuss their own experiences of marginalisation and discrimination with the editors working for the publishers to offer their unique insight. But of course, everyone loves to jump on their look at those evil woke sensitivity readers ruining our favourite books bandwagon. It would seem to me that if you want to be angry at someone, be angry at Puffin and Netflix, not inclusive minds. Anyway, we're back in. Suzanne Moore, writing for The Telegraph, called the
Disagree.
sensitivity
If you're mad about this, you would be.
and called the edits a sign of the further degradation of the publishing industry, the most nepotistic and middle-class clan you could ever meet. To which singer-songwriter Billy Bragg tweeted in retaliation, "Suppose your mum wears a hairpiece due to chemotherapy, and kids in your class call her a witch because they read in Dahl's book that witches all wear wigs. You'd think that as a feminist, Suzanne Moore would have some sympathy, but no, because woke." Susan Nossel, speaking on behalf of PEN America, tweeted that if we start down the path of trying to correct for perceived slights instead of allowing readers to receive and react to books as written, we risk distorting the work of great authors and clouding the essential lens that literature offers on society. The Queen Consort weighed in, urging authors to remain true to your calling, unimpeded by those who may wish to curb the freedom of your expression or impose limits on your imagination. Even Rishi Sunak voiced his view via a spokesperson that when it comes to our rich and varied literary heritage, the Prime Minister agrees with the BFG that we shouldn't gobble funk around with words. We have always defended the right to free speech and expression. Lots of people kept referencing George Orwell's 1984, and this passage in particular. Every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every book rewritten. Every picture has been repainted. Every statue and street building has been renamed. Every date has been altered. And the process is continuing, day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. Salman Rushdie tweeted that Roald Dahl was no angel, but this is absurd censorship. Puffin Books and the Dahl estate should be ashamed. Lots of people argued we should leave the books as they are. Others thought including a content warning at the start of the books to contextualise outdated language and sentiments was the way forward. Some, like author Phil Pullman, argued that if Dahl's writing offends us, let him go out of print. Read all these wonderful authors who are writing today who don't get as much of a look in.
Yes!
Commercial ground people like Roald Dahl. Then there's a characteristically inane take offered by Boris Johnson, who, according to The Guardian, in one breath criticises sensitivity edit of authors' works and also rejects sending Parthenon marbles to Greece, expressing his irritation at wokeness and political correctness, while arguing at the same time, I guess, that returning the Parthenon marbles to Greece would leave a huge gap in the British Museum's ability to tell the story of world history, and worries that if you give everything back to Greece, and I'm quoting here, above all, you have no answer in the years ahead to the theoretical claims for restitution from Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, Nigeria, everywhere, whose treasures are housed in Bloomsbury. And suddenly, in trying to please the world and correct thinking, you've deprived the world of one of its great treasures and cut some vital panels from its great pageant of human progress. Then he added that the public's freedom to call him a whacker while he was out jogging showed what a wonderful country Britain was, which I can't argue with. But then he used this as an example of how minimal is the distance between the government and the governed. It was a very short article, but it took me on a journey. As you can see, the Dahl edits gleaned a seismic reaction. Now, this is a lot of information to take in, there are lots of opinions flying around, so I'm going to try and boil it down to the two arguments that crop up time and again in the articles and videos weighing in on the Dahl debate. And they are the rewriting of history argument. This goes something like, Dahl wrote some bigoted things, but if we remove them from his work, we're pretending they were never written, that people never spoke that way, and never used those words. Children shouldn't be shielded from the past. They should be taught that this is a word people used, this is why it's bad, and look at the progress we've made. Then there's the slippery slope argument that goes, if we allow these edits to be made, we open the door to more extreme forms of literary censorship. Letting this happen now will lead to that happening in the future. Now, I understand these arguments, and I agree with them in theory. But in practice, when applied to the Dahl edits to this specific situation, something doesn't sit right with me. And I think it's the lack of nuance. It's the fear-mongering that takes these edits, which by themselves are, I would say, pretty harmless, to extremes. Now, I'm particularly irked by the rewriting of history as a concept. While, of course, it's incredibly important not to paint over the uglier aspects of the past, to own up to them and to face them to ensure we don't repeat them, we also rewrite history all the time, and it's important to do so because history is always evolving. To assume that history is all fact and all set in stone is incorrect.
Oh, no, come on.
And, historically, that perspective has been that of the white, straight, cis, wealthy, victorious male. So let's not pretend history is this immovable mass of absolute truth. A lot of it needs rewriting.
It's being rewritten. That's not what they mean when they say history's being rewritten. Come on. You know what they're talking about. About something completely different. Yes, the history needs to be rewritten because the parchment's getting old. Yes, I know history's being written. I'm talking about rewritten. They're talking about, and I'm talking about rewritten in a way that does not transmit the history that existed. That's what people are talking about. So you can't say it's a figure of speech, an idiom. It's not actually literally rewriting history, because the history always existed. We have internet scans of the old books. They exist. Jesus Christ. No. That was bad. That was a bad one by her.
But to make room for and to reflect the lives, experiences, and stories of more people. And in this case, I don't believe that editing Roald Dahl is rewriting history. Yeah, if we edited every book ever written beyond beyond recognition and repeated that process on a daily basis, we'd have a problem. But this isn't that. This is one example of editing that's been seized by the press and taken to extremes, and that also seems to ignore the fact that texts are edited all the time in various different ways and for various different reasons. As a spokesperson for Puffin stressed, it's not unusual for publishers to review and update language as the meaning and impact of words changes over time. I've also spoken to a fair few people who say that when they're reading Dahl to their kids, they actually edit as they read aloud. So parents and teachers are already updating the language. This isn't new, what Puffin are doing to Dahl. But
Yeah, no, and let them do that because that's at their discretion.
Edit Dahl today. What's to stop anyone taking any text and editing it however they see fit tomorrow? This is kind of what the Orwell quote suggests, right? And I get it. But again, to me, that's taking this one instance of editing to dystopian extremes. The slippery slope argument seems to imply that the Dahl edits will be the catalyst for a wave of censorship that grips the world and changes it beyond recognition. But the truth is that the editing of children's literature was alive and well, long before February 2023. Thomas Bowdler published The Family Shakespeare in 1807, an edition of Shakespeare's plays
So we should let it keep going on.
Audience, giving us the term Bowdlerized. Abridged versions of classic children's stories like Alice in Wonderland and Little Women were routinely published in the 20th century, and outdated terms and racist language in Enid Blyton's books have been removed. I'd like to think that the majority of people don't miss Blyton's racial slurs, and that their removal hasn't erased history or sent us whizzing down a slippery slope so slippery we can't tell a book from a cat. And I'd like to think that removing the outdated terms in Roald Dahl won't lead the majority of people into a pit of despair, only able to frantically exclaim,
"We'll never dance to another song."
As school librarian Lucas Maxwell puts it, unfortunately, when things like this happen, it brings out the worst in those who claim that they can no longer say whatever they want, which is untrue. You can still say whatever you want. It's just that now there are more consequences to offensive behaviour. And this is what they're actually upset about, being called out on this. Now, you might be thinking, okay, all that aside, how can you see the value in any of these edits? How can you think they're worth considering? Even if Dahl does contain outdated or offensive terms, we shouldn't be sanitising literature. And I'd like to answer that by drawing attention to the fact that these are children's books. As Justin Lee Anderson, writing for The Bookseller, argues, children are sponges. They're constantly learning from the world around them about what is normal, what's acceptable, and where their place is. And they don't only learn what we mean to teach them. So I think it's not just valid, but vital to ask, what are we inadvertently teaching children? Now, my instinct is that books written for adults that contain offensive or outdated language and ideas shouldn't be edited in the same way that Dahl's books have been. Because most adults are
In the same way,
contextualizing the content.
should never be
It's unlikely that an adult
rewritten.
will read a racist slur in a book and think, well, my favourite author uses it, so I'm going to use it. A child, naive of the context, might. But am I being dismissive of the potential dangers that arise when we edit a book out of its time?
Are you
We're
naive,
still left
girl?
with the question of censorship. And censorship is a very, very complicated question. To be for or against censorship, as such, is to assume a freedom no one has. Censorship is. That quote probably sounds quite menacing, but I think it elucidates an important point. That censorship exists in many forms, has done for a very long time, and that it's a lot more complicated than a simple for or against stance. Censorship is nothing new. In ancient Rome, the censor was an elected official whose job it was to do things like maintain the census and to ensure moral conduct amongst the people. And fun fact, the word censor is related by the Latin censere, meaning to assess or tax, to our word for the official count of members of a population, census. In ancient China, a censor was a government official charged primarily with the responsibility for scrutinizing and criticizing the conduct of officials and rulers. During Shakespeare's heyday at the end of the 16th century, it was the job of the master of the revels to read through and, you guessed it, censor plays before they could be published. And the publication history of Shakespeare's sonnets has an interesting relationship to editing and censorship, including a revision in 1640, in which the love poems addressed to the young man were revised to instead address a woman. We've been censoring since the dawn of civilization, and as you might have guessed,
That's
our
not
relationship with
good.
what to
That's
censor
no bueno.
is evolved based on our social, religious, and
That's
political
not
sensibilities.
bueno.
The Catholic Church,
We
for
shouldn't
example,
do
was
that.
behind the fig leaf campaign of the 1500s, during which proponents hunted for all the nude sculptures in Rome and started the campaign of carefully placing metal fig leaves to cover the genitals. The fig leaf was symbolic of sin. Adam and Eve covered their shameful naked bodies with fig leaves in the Bible, and so nudity, under the fig leaf campaign, was censored. Religion has often been a driving force behind different forms of censorship. In 1642, when England was without a monarch and ruled by Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth, theatres were closed for 18 years because the presiding Puritan view was that plays were filled with lascivious mirth and levity incompatible with the seriousness and focus
Lascivious.
required of a true Christian of the realm. And P.S., when the monarchy was restored in 1660 and the playhouses reopened, a tidal wave of incredibly smutty plays took the stage by storm. Fast forward to January 2023, and you'll find Republican politicians
Wario,
legislating anti-drag
the old
legislation in
Wario.
at least 14 bills across at least 8 states that seeks to, you guessed it again, censor drag performances in a way that closely coincides with the widespread anti-trans backlash and homophobic agenda, such as Florida's Don't Say Gay legislation that curtails the discussion of LGBTQ+ issues in schools. And let's not forget the literal banning of books about race and LGBTQ+ topics in conservative states. Now, these are mere drops in the ocean of examples I could use to illustrate the point that censorship has a long, long history that reflects the sensibilities of an age. Right now, for example, we're in the middle of a vehement anti-trans hate storm, so censoring drag and discouraging discussions of LGBTQ+ issues is perceived by bigots as a way of doing what those Roman censors did thousands of years ago, ensuring moral conduct. So, you might be thinking, oh my god, censorship is horrific. Just look at those examples. It's oppressive, it's life-threatening. Censorship is a tool used to subordinate anyone who doesn't meet the status quo. But does this mean that censorship is, without fail, a tool used by bigots for the purposes of oppression? Alas, it is, of course, far more complicated than that. And a lot of it is a matter of perspective. As Catherine O'Leary puts it, censorship has always been with us in some form in all societies, and may be simultaneously viewed as positive or negative. The term itself can refer to various types of restriction and control, and it's affected by changing social and political contexts. It's linked to a series of concepts such as freedom of expression, decency, political correctness, and the common good, which are also difficult to define and are open to conflicting interpretations. This is a gigantic and incredibly fraught concept to discuss, so I'm going to boil it down as best I can. In certain circumstances, and from certain perspectives, censorship oppresses minorities. In others, and to others, it protects them. other rights with the freedom of expression, insisting that the latter is a fundamental right and that free speech is always going to be hurtful, so deal with it. Others argue that censorship can be protective, productive, and progressive. Anti-discrimination laws, for example, that, in theory, prevent people from being discriminated against because of their race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, etc., censor, again in theory, people from spouting hateful drivel without consequence. According to O'Leary, many people, particularly in contemporary Western democratic societies, are willing to accept, if not advocate, a range of limitations on freedom of expression, often linked to the imposition of restrictions on racist, homophobic, or misogynistic texts or speech acts, or for the protection of children. What is appropriate to do or say in any given society at a given time is in part a result of censorship. It's why white writers of however many years ago freely used the N-word in their novels to describe black people, and why we don't, or certainly shouldn't, do that now. It's why this horrendously sexist song was banned in students' unions and bars. It's why there's an alternate version of everyone's favourite or least favourite Christmas song, Fairy Tale of New York, that removes the homophobic F-word from the lyrics. And on that point, as Luke Turner wrote for The Guardian in 2020, as a bisexual man, a load of straight people suddenly singing cheap, lousy has made me feel uncomfortable. It isn't their word to sing. A load of white lads doing the gun fingers and rapping the N-word along with hip-hop has rightly been beyond the pale for years. Removing the word isn't rewriting history. Not screaming the homophobic F-word on top of your lungs on Christmas Eve isn't going to mean people forget homophobia existed, because it exists. Even though some will have you believe that this means
We'll never dance to another song.
it's arguable that by doing something as small as removing that word, we work to denormalize it as a slur. To some, these kinds of small changes probably seem insignificant. There are bigger issues facing marginalized communities that need to take priority. But that doesn't mean we can't do both. Plus, it's arguable that making small changes is the most
Why
practical
only
way to
have
affect
1.
big change over a long
Why do I
period.
only have
All these things
1.5k?
interlinked. At this juncture, it's probably useful to recognise that all this comes down to a matter of perspective, right? What's evil 1984-style censorship to one person is an important assurance of moral conduct to another. But censorship itself, a word which I think tends to immediately invoke ideas of oppression and fear, is also kind of at the heart of basic decency and progress. Considering and potentially modifying what we want to say and do is arguably a form of self-censorship. I mean, I might be really angry at someone, but I'll try to consider their point of view, take a beat, consider my response, instead of unleashing all my feelings in an immediate reaction because free speech. Censorship, as well as being oppressive and damaging, can play a role in combating hate speech. It probably sounds strange to say, but censorship can be good when it's punching up instead of down, when it's not being used by governments to protect themselves, but to protect those in need of protection. But regardless,
Punching up.
we shouldn't be
What is
censoring
that
Dahl. He's not as
exactly?
bad as all that. Oh, wait, what's that? Under pressure from his publishers in 1973, Dahl himself removed some of his racist language from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, originally published in 1964? The National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, NAACP, objected to Dahl's original portrayal of the Oompa Loompas as African pygmies, which carried echoes of both the Gold Coast slave labour used to produce chocolate in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and the transatlantic slave trade. Censorship is why, in what is arguably Dahl's most famous children's book, we no longer have to read this. Aren't they fantastic? No higher than my knee. Their skin is almost black. You know what I think, Grandpa? Cried Charlie. I think Mr. Wonka has made them himself, out of chocolate. Wonka then denies this, but agrees with
That's
Charlie
really
they are
funny.
indeed pygmies imported direct from Africa. They belong to a tribe of tiny miniature pygmies known as Oompa Loompas. I discovered them myself. I brought them over from Africa myself, the whole tribe of them, 3,000 in all. I found them in the very deepest and darkest part of the African jungle where no white man had ever been before. This horrendously racist stereotyping was removed. It's not okay. It never was okay. Unfortunately, it's been gone since 1973, and we're better off for it. Now, to some, because Dahl made those changes himself, there's no problem with this form of censorship. It's because he's dead, and the changes to his books are being made in 2023 that's the problem. These are edits he can't consent to. But people don't live forever, so if a book contains material that could be deemed offensive, and the author can't personally verify their alteration or deletion, what's to be done? If Dahl had been dead in 1973, would the general consensus
Don't change it.
in the racist material? And what about books that are published posthumously? Editing is a very complicated job, and the ethics behind it is something I want to investigate, so subscribe and let me know in the comments if that's something you'd like to learn about. And, to complicate matters further, in the case of the 2023 Dahl edits, is it censorship? Not according to author and chair of the Society of Authors, Joanne Harris, who tweeted, "Note to anyone who needs it today. Publishers updating a book with the approval of the author's estate to ensure its saleability is not censorship. It's just
Fuck
business.
the- fuck
The government forces
estates.
publishers to edit or suppress books to promote its own agenda.
Fuck
That's
estates.
censorship." Harris went on to suggest that changes to a text are only censorship if they aren't consented to, and as Dahl's estate consented to those changes, this is not an issue of censorship. She also highlights another important point that keeps coming up in the Dahl debate, that these edits are just business. There's no religious or political censorious agenda at play here. Updating the texts is, in principle, a business-savvy strategy. In an article for Big Issue, Mark Burrows argued that plans to edit Roald Dahl's books to take out offensive terms aren't opening a new front in the culture wars, they're simply about continuing to make money. There's no slippery slope here, other than perhaps the inevitable sleigh ride through the dregs of late-stage capitalism. The Dahl edits aren't a pox on literature or a censorious nightmare. They're simply a way of continuing the franchise by making the language within them more relevant and accessible to children in 2023. Burrows continues, "It's easy to cast this stuff as culture war fodder. We're living in a state of perpetual outrage of one form or another. How dare these sanctimonious wokies tinker with the sacred texts of snot and filth that have so delighted children for decades? Most people are missing the point. The Dahl estate, which is already sensitive about this stuff, having issued a full apology for the author's notorious anti-Semitism a few years back, knows the value of its product. In making these edits, publishers are attempting to future.
Oh my
They're
God!
not doing it for adults. Adults don't
We're on
care.
15,
They understand
come on
the
now.
context, and they're not really doing it for the good of children either. It's about keeping the books selling. If kids sense a book is outdated, they're going to close it pretty quickly and not pick up another one. And it's this possibility that has led some to criticise Puffin for virtue signalling. As Jemima Steinfeld writes, justification for the Dahl modifications seems to be along the lines of commitment to diversity and inclusivity, something we can all get behind. If Puffin and Netflix are so committed to these values, why don't they invest in and support authors from other backgrounds? After all, Roald Dahl was a white male with an anti-Semitic track record. He's hardly the poster boy of 2023. And if this is the case, if the publishers and Netflix don't care about inclusivity and diversity in any real way, is it possible that the whole controversy could be a publicity stunt? It certainly riled people up, got people talking about Dahl, enforcing his relevance and status as a cherished children's author. This is, very likely a bit of a conspiracy theory on my part, but it's not inconceivable that these big businesses who we can safely assume care about profit above all else have maybe benefited financially from the backlash. And this is one way in which the exploitation of the culture wars narrative can be extremely insidious. But it's not the only way. Sadly, yet unsurprisingly, the people working for Inclusive Minds on the Dahl edits have been the targets of online abuse. The Daily Mail published an article called Roald Dahl books were neutered by woke consultants aged 8 to 30, led by non-binary, asexual, polyamorous relationship anarchist who is on the autism spectrum, referring to one inclusion ambassador in particular, who described himself as such, and attempting, of course, to belittle their credibility by suggesting that, oh, of course these evil edits were made by one of those silly, neurodiverse, wokey, nonconformist youths. And multiple articles followed suit. They relished getting to mention this person's gender identity, sexuality, neurodiversity, and polyamory, as though doing so was their ace in the hole. Look, I don't blame anyone for fearing censorship. Censorship certainly has the potential to be very scary. The idea of not being able to say what you think or feel, to do what you want to do, to be restricted by the powers that be, that's dictatorial, totalitarian mind control. But is it fair or helpful to equate the efforts of Inclusive Minds, whose intentions are to make children's literature more inclusive, with dictatorial, totalitarian mind control? I don't think so. But the edits have given way to this childish, dismissive, and deliberate aggression, spearheaded by right-wing news outlets and individuals, that forms the insidious core of the Dahl debate. It's an incredible paradox, in which GB News, Piers Morgan and co. tout unrestricted freedom of speech, while bullying and silencing anyone who expresses a difference of opinion. The incredibly aggressive response to the changes has worked as its own form of censorship, belittling and humiliating anyone who dares to even touch upon an alternate point of view. Here's a perfect example of that.
The old Enid Blyton books have language in that would be basically illegal to say to somebody now. We have to accept that some books have to be adapted, particularly with racial of language. But for children, particularly with children without parents to explain, in some ways...
Be realistic. Is a child that doesn't have a parent to explain going to be given a Roald Dahl? No,
absolutely, because they're in the library at school.
Wouldn't it make much more sense rather than suppressing...
But they haven't been told it's a naughty word.
Of course they've been told it's a naughty word.
Let's let Rebecca respond. I think reading should be enjoyable, it should be fun, there is no enormous high-mindedness about it. It should be fun, great.
Wouldn't you like to see everything censored?
Would you give your child
On that maxim then, you could be saying to yourself, okay, well maybe we shouldn't have Cinderella because it might be offensive to kids from blended families.
This is silly and it's pathetic, and you are on the side of the Puritans. You and you, Bowdler, you and you, Paul IV, wanting to go and stick fig leaves on statues. Aren't you ashamed of it? Isn't yours a generation which is simply pathetic and frightened and suppressing and puritanical?
Nobody is saying to children, let's watch Pulp Fiction. Everybody believes on a certain level.
What about reading the Bible? So you want the Quran censored?
I think this has become intellectually dishonest at this point.
This footage is upsetting. Starkey is so aggressive, so rude, has such a tantrum. The presenter completely eggs him on. Reed has no real opportunity to make her point uninterrupted, which is a good point to consider. She's arguing that, yes, maybe in an ideal world, we'd leave the outdated language in and contextualise it for children, help them understand the past. But is that always practical? No, we can't police what children read 24/7. So, yeah, she tries to make a reasonable point. And even if it wasn't a reasonable point, do we shout over people in debates? Do we insult their entire generation? Do we make utterly ludicrous leaps from one issue to another in a move that is absolutely, as she says, intellectually dishonest? On GB News we do. Now, I'm not for one second suggesting that if you passionately disagree with the Dahl edits, you're a bigot. You probably care about the dangers of censorship, and absolutely fair enough. But this form of aggression, this reaction that we see from GB News et al. Is not okay. And I bet it has very little to do with protecting free speech or protecting history. It's censorship in brute form. It's a bid for control from those who shout loudest, who mock, who bully, who punch down, and who do so to silence the rest. You might be left thinking, but how do we know when censorship has gone too far? I think it's easy to be like,
I wouldn't call that
surely everything
censorship
offends somebody. How
anywhere
can we
near
possibly
of the same
be? And
kind.
yes, think of a thing, there's probably someone out there who's offended by it. But to rest on that argument, to do nothing when people say or do hateful and hurtful things, to make no changes, to refuse to evolve, is a form of passivity that means no progress is ever made.
There are some nursery rhymes that were changed so long ago that many of us don't remember what their original words were. Things like "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a tiger by its toe." It wasn't originally tiger. It was N-word. And there are a number of these classic rhymes that in their original iteration would be very offensive to the contemporary ear.
Now, she raises this point and he brushes it off and it's never revisited. But it's an important concern to raise. Look back at the kinds of things children said, did, played with 50 years ago, and there are things that I bet most people would agree are not appropriate today. Ultimately, I'm in two minds about
So
how
don't
much
let them
Dahl
play with
edits
it. Don't
matter,
change
how
the
effective they be
history.
at making children feel more included.
The
language
I
is
don't
important,
understand.
and making moves towards a more inclusive and diverse literary canon
They're doing it,
is important
as
work,
you said,
even
to
though it
make
might not
money.
seem as urgent as tackling other, louder, more obvious issues of inequality.
Fuck them.
Puffin seemed to have closed the
I
case
hate
anyway, and
estates.
raged
I always
to the idea.
have.
But I hope that whether you agree or disagree about
You
the
have a
value of
fucking
language, or what you
estate?
believe about
The
editing literature in
fuck?
general, you can avoid this kind of nonsense and engage in a respectful conversation.
Oh
But what
my
about your
word.
relationship to Roald Dahl? I think it's likely that for some of us, part of the anger over the edits comes from a passionate love of the books. What do we do if something we love, have loved since childhood, is deemed outdated or bigoted? I love Sex and the City. It has aged appallingly. These statements are not mutually exclusive. Now, I wasn't old enough to watch it when it first aired, so I don't know, maybe it was considered bigoted in the 90s. I love Sex and the City because it's nostalgic, it's comforting to me, it's entertaining. I'm also told that when it first aired, there were far, far fewer programs that showcased women talking openly about their sexuality than there are today, so it was a trailblazer in that respect. Watching it today, which I do semi-regularly, I wince at a lot of things the characters say. From biphobia, to transphobia, to tone-deaf racism, to extraordinarily classist depictions of wealth, it's just bad.
I'm very into labels. Gay, straight. Pick a side and stay there. I am paying a fortune to live in a neighborhood that's trendy by day and trendy by night. Get your big black ass out of my face! Can you tell me how much the bus is? Really? Wow, last time I took the bus it was like 75 cents. You know, for $3 more you can take a cab.
It's very easy for tensions to arise when a show, game, book, film, whatever that you love is challenged. It's easy to feel personally attacked when a piece of art that you love is attacked. You tell me Sex and the City is bigoted, but what I hear is they're telling me I'm bigoted for liking that show. It's intertwined immediately with my identity, and this poses a problem when it comes to debating these things, because it's easier for me to be defensive if I feel personally attacked, if my childhood, my nostalgia, is threatened. Rebecca Alford, from online bookseller World of Books, was quoted by The Telegraph as saying that due to the edits, some parents will be sad that some of the magic from their childhood could be lost. And this, I think, is a big part of the problem. Nostalgia for our childhoods, colouring our judgment. Let's say the edits do remove the magic that older generations associate with doll. That doesn't take the magic out of your childhood, or mine. And it doesn't have to remove the magic from my child's childhood. Why must I impose my magic on them? You know, they'll find their own magic. I understand the feeling, but I think we need to let
Oh, read them from books.
It's okay to love a piece of art that has aged atrociously, to love the work of an artist who is an absolute asshole. It doesn't make me a bad person for loving Sex and the City. It can be a problem, however, if, because of my love for the show, I refuse to acknowledge that those biphobic, transphobic, racist, and classist comments are not okay. And it's also a problem if I actively endorse a creator or franchise who continues to promote bigoted sentiments. I hope that the contemporary shows, books, games, etc. that I love today are deemed problematic in the future, because it's a reminder that things change and time moves on, and hopefully we become more inclusive as a society. I don't think shows like Sex and the City should be banned from all streaming platforms or anything like that, but they probably shouldn't be promoted centre stage over newer shows that represent more people fairly. And this is kind of what Philip Pullman argues, right? That maybe the best option is to let Dahl go out of print, not to ban him or edit him, but to let new, more progressive authors have their moment in the sun. You are perfectly entitled to adore Roald Dahl and his books if you wish. I mean, my favourite film of all time is Matilda, which obviously wouldn't have existed without Dahl's writing. And recognising that there are things in those books that we might not write today or expect from a contemporary author shouldn't necessarily diminish our affections. So, to return to the big questions I opened this video with, what is censorship? Who knows? It is, like so many things, disputed across the board. To some, it's empowering. To others, it's evil. We know that it's everywhere, and has been forever. To define it in certain terms is a challenge I'm not interested in taking on. Is it ever okay to edit an author's works? Yes, I think so. Sometimes it's okay, but how far we take those edits, what we censor or change or alter is another question which, again, I don't think there is a clear answer to. What gives us the right to read?
Now editors, fuck editors.
Another question I barely know how to answer. Honestly, I think I included it for its wordplay value.
What
right? Who gives it? Are we rewriting? Aren't we always
At the
rewriting?
author's behest.
That is incredibly difficult, perhaps impossible, to answer these big questions clearly. And that these are some of the key questions being asked in the Dahl debate and answered by loud bigots suggests to me that they're the wrong questions to be asking. We're not going to find an easy solution when asking big questions like these that have been debated since the dawn of civilization. So perhaps we should ask smaller questions. Judge things like the Dahl edits on a case-by-case basis, while also being aware of the potentials and context and dangers and benefits as well. Consider these things with more nuance and compassion, and try not to take everything to extremes. Editing Dahl today doesn't mean you'll never dance to another song tomorrow. But if editing books over time is common practice, why did GB News make such a stink about the Dahl edits? The dark answer to that question has its roots in the manipulative potential of populism. To learn more about the link between populism, right-wing politics, and Shakespeare, click here next.
Oh my goodness. $96. Oh my god. How did I live that? Good RNG. No. Oh my god. Sushi.